Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. Alright, so I never thought my love for being alone would land me in such a mess. Back in 2019, I was stationed up at Olympic National Park in Washington State. Name's Finnegan, Finn O'Malley. But most folks just call me Finn. I've always been a bit of a loner, drawn to the wilderness like a moth to a porch light. It's a place where a guy can actually hear himself think, you know? No constant buzz of the city. Growing up in a small town, I learned to appreciate the simple things. A good, strong cup of coffee. A bad joke that still makes you chuckle. That morning I set out on a routine patrol through one of the less traveled sections of the park. Not a lot of tourists go that way, which suited me just fine. I packed my gear, just the essentials, and headed into the forest. The trees up there are massive, and the canopy was so thick it filtered the sunlight into this soft green glow, made everything feel alive, I guess. A couple of hours into my hike, I stumbled on something weird. There were these deep gouges in the trunks of several trees, higher than any bear could reach, and they were spaced too close together to be from an elk rubbing against the bark. I snapped a few photos with my phone, making a mental note to report it back at the station. As I kept going, I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. The usual forest sounds, birds singing, leaves rustling, had gone quiet. It was like the whole woods were holding their breath. I laughed at myself, figuring I was just letting my imagination run wild. Around midday, I reached a clearing where I planned to eat lunch. As I unwrapped my sandwich pastrami on rye, if you're curious, I noticed how freaky still it was. No wind, no insects buzzing, nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A large figure darted between the trees, too fast for me to get a good look. Probably just a deer, I muttered, but I wasn't convinced. I decided to head back. As I was packing up, this awful smell hit me, like a mix of wet dog and something rotting. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I scanned the area, but I didn't see anything. But that feeling of being watched, it was undeniable now. On the trail back, I found footprints in the soft ground. They were huge, unlike any animal tracks I'd ever seen. Long and narrow, with what looked like 4 toes ending in sharp points. I took another photo and picked up my pace, a little freaked out now. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. It wasn't human, but it didn't sound like any animal I knew either. My heart was hammering in my chest as I tried to figure out where it came from. Then I saw it. This massive creature, emerging from the shadows about 50 yards ahead. It stood upright, at least 8 feet tall, with matted, ash-colored fur. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in these clawed hands that looked like they could tear through steel. The head was kind of like a hyena's, but all messed up, jaws too big, way too many teeth. I froze. The thing locked eyes with me, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then it snarled and charged. Instinct took over. I turned and ran faster than I ever thought possible, adrenaline pumping like crazy. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear branches snapping, and those heavy footfalls gaining on me. Up ahead, I spotted a fallen tree leaning against a rocky outcrop, forming a small crevice. Without even thinking, I dove into the gap, squeezing myself into that tight space. The creature thundered past, unable to stop in time. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't realize where I was hiding. I could hear it slowing down, sniffing the air. It let out this frustrated, guttural growl. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, cramped and trembling. Eventually, the noises faded away. I cautiously crawled out, every muscle aching. The forest was silent again, but I knew I wasn't safe. I needed to get back to the station and warn the others. As I made my way back, I stumbled on a gruesome scene. 3 hikers, scattered across the path, their bodies torn apart, lifeless. I recognized one of them, a young guy named Kevin, who had checked in at the station that morning. A wave of anger mixed with fear washed over me. These people didn't stand a chance against whatever that thing was. I radioed in, but the signal was weak. All I managed to get through was, "Emergency at Sector 4. Casualties. Need backup." I heard static and a faint reply before the line went dead. Knowing help might be on the way, I decided to see if I could find any survivors. As I searched, I heard a faint groan. One of the hikers, a woman in her 30s, was still alive, but barely. She had deep gashes across her torso, and her breathing was shallow. "Hang in there," I said, applying pressure to her wounds. "Help is coming." Her eyes flickered open. "It came out of nowhere," she whispered. "I know, just stay with me." She nodded weakly, then her eyes closed and she went still. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. I sat back, my hands covered in blood. The weight of everything just crashed down on me. I had to do something before more people got hurt. Gathering my resolve, I decided to try to lure the creature away from any populated areas. I know making myself bait wasn't the brightest idea, but it was the only one I had. I picked up a fallen branch and made a makeshift torch using some dry grass and a lighter I always carried. "All right, Ugly," I muttered. "Let's finish this." I set the torch ablaze and waved it above my head, shouting at the top of my lungs. The noise echoed through the forest. It didn't take long for that thing to show up, its eyes reflecting the firelight with this evil gleam. It charged again, but this time I stood my ground. At the last second, I sidestepped and swung the torch, hitting it across the face. The flames caught on its fur, and it recoiled, shrieking in pain. Seizing the chance, I ran deeper into the woods, leading it away from the main trails. The creature followed, enraged and relentless. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind me. I reached a ravine I remembered from earlier patrols, a steep drop into rocky terrain. With the creature closing in, I had one shot. I leaped across the gap, landing hard on the other side. My ankle twisted, sending a jolt of pain up my leg. The creature skidded to a halt at the edge, its momentum nearly carrying it over. For a moment, it teetered, claws scrambling for purchase. Then the ground gave way, and it plummeted into the ravine below. I limped to the edge and looked down. The creature lay motionless among the rocks. I wasn't sure if it was dead, but it definitely wasn't getting up anytime soon. Exhausted, I started making my way back toward the station, using the trees for support. After what felt like forever, I emerged from the forest to find a team of rangers and emergency personnel waiting. "Finn, over here," someone called. Relief washed over me as I collapsed to the ground. Medics rushed over, checking me out. "What happened out there?" my supervisor, a guy named Marcus, asked. "There's something in the ravine about 2 miles east," I said between breaths. "It attacked some hikers. They're gone." He exchanged glances with the others. "We'll send a team to investigate right now. Let's get you taken care of." They loaded me into an ambulance, and as we drove away, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when they found that creature, or if they'd even find it at all. A few days later, I was back at the station, my ankle wrapped and my arm in a sling from all the scratches. The official report listed the incident as a bear attack, but I knew better. When I questioned the higher-ups, they gave me the usual runaround. "Let it go, Finn," Marcus advised. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." I decided to take his advice. After all, arguing with management was like trying to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig. One evening, as I was closing up the office, I found a note slipped under the door. It read, "Be careful in the woods. Not everything is as it seems." I chuckled. No kidding. The next morning I was back on patrol. As I walked the familiar trails, I kept my eyes open and my senses sharp, but the forest seemed normal again. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze. Another ranger, a guy named Ben, caught up with me. "Heard you had quite the adventure," he said with a grin. "You could say that. Think you'll take some time off?" "Nah, the trees would miss me too much." He laughed. "You're a glutton for punishment, Finn. Better than a desk job," I replied. We continued our patrol, the sun filtering through the branches above. Life went on, as it tends to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was holding more secrets than I'd ever know. As we reached a fork in the trail, Ben turned to me. "You lead the way." I smirked. "Sure, you want to follow me? I have a knack for finding trouble. That's what makes it interesting." "All right then," I said. "Adventure awaits." We headed down the path, the day's possibilities stretching out before us. After all, what's the worst that could happen? Just another day in the park. Endings aren't usually my strong suit, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that Mother Nature has a twisted sense of humor. And who am I to argue with that? I've always found peace in the rolling hills of Shenandoah National Park. That's where, back in 2021, I spent most of my days patrolling the trails, making sure visitors respected the land. My name's Finn Riley, but most folks just call me Finn. Growing up in a small Virginia town, I developed a love for the outdoors early on, thanks to my grandpa, who taught me everything from fishing to identifying bird calls. Of course, I never quite mastered the art of starting a campfire without singeing my eyebrows, a talent that earned me a few laughs around the ranger station. On a crisp October morning, I was assigned to check the remote stretches of the Appalachian Trail that wound through our park. The leaves were turning shades of amber and crimson, and hikers flocked to catch the autumn spectacle. My colleague, Maya Rodriguez, a sharp-witted ranger with a penchant for bad puns, joined me. She once joked that between the two of us, we had one fully functioning brain, hers mostly. "Finn, did you hear about the mathematician who's afraid of negative numbers?" she asked as we set off. "He'll stop at nothing to avoid them." I chuckled, shaking my head. Your jokes are like the park compost heap, ripe and recycled. We headed toward a less traveled path, where a few campers had reported strange noises at night. Probably just a bear rummaging for food. But protocol was protocol. As we hiked deeper, the canopy thickened, and the sounds of chattering tourists faded away. After an hour, we reached a small clearing where we found an abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, and belongings were scattered. A backpack, torn open, food supplies strewn about. Looks like a bear got here, Maya remarked, kneeling to inspect claw marks on a tree. But something felt off. The claw marks were unusually high, and the spacing didn't match any animal I knew. That's odd, I said. Black bears around here don't get that tall. Maybe it's a bear on stilts, she quipped. The circus is in town after all. Either that or Bigfoot finally decided to go camping, I replied, trying to shake off a creeping unease. We cataloged the site, took photographs, and collected what we could. I radioed back to the station to report the findings. Our supervisor, Mark Johnson, instructed us to keep investigating but to stay alert. As we moved on, the forest grew denser. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent. No birds chirping, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. You notice how quiet it is? Maya whispered. Yeah, I replied. It's like Mother Nature muted herself. Even the wind took a day off. We pressed forward, reaching a narrow ravine bridged by a fallen log. Below, a shallow stream trickled over rocks. I went first, carefully balancing as I crossed. Maya followed, but halfway across she froze. Finn, do you smell that? She asked. I inhaled deeply. There was a faint, acrid odor, like sulfur mixed with decay. Maybe something died nearby, I offered, not believing it myself. Comforting, she muttered, continuing across. On the other side, we found deep impressions in the soft soil. Footprints unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were elongated, with 4 toes ending in sharp points. Okay, that's definitely not a bear, I said. Maya snapped photos. Could be a prank. Some teenager with a homemade mold trying to spook hikers. Maybe. But why go through all that trouble out here? We decided to follow the tracks, which led further into the forest. The smell grew stronger, and the trees around us bore the same high claw marks. Feels like we're being herded, Maya observed. Toward what, though? I tried to sound casual, but my nerves were fraying. Probably a surprise party. Rangers of the Year awards, she joked weakly. Great. I hope they have cake. We reached another clearing, this one dominated by a massive ancient oak. At its base lay the remains of a deer, or what was left of it. The carcass was mutilated, deep gashes exposing bone. Jesus, Maya breathed. No animal does this. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. We should head back, report this, and get a team out here. As we turned to leave, a sound echoed through the trees, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate the very air. What was that? Maya asked, her eyes wide. Probably just the wind playing tricks, I said, though I didn't believe it. The noise came again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind. It was more like the reverberation of heavy machinery, but there was no equipment for miles. We need to move, I urged. We retraced our steps, but the path seemed different. Landmarks we had passed were gone, and the terrain felt unfamiliar. Did we take a wrong turn? Maya asked. I don't think so. It's like the forest changed. Forests don't just rearrange themselves, Finn. Tell that to this one. The rumbling noise followed us, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly near. Shadows flickered at the edge of our vision, but whenever we turned, there was nothing. Maybe we should radio for help, Maya suggested. I reached for my radio, but all I got was static. That's not good. Of course, the one time we need technology, it fails us, she said. Well, on the bright side, we won't have to file those tedious reports if we never make it back. Dark humor, Finn. Didn't peg you for that. Desperate times. We pressed on, picking up our pace. The light was fading, and the thought of being out here after dark was unsettling. We broke into a jog, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Then we heard a scream, a man's voice, raw and terrified. Did you hear that? I stopped. Yeah, came from over there. Without hesitation, we ran toward the sound, bursting through a thicket. We stumbled upon another ranger, a guy named Ben, lying on the ground. His uniform was torn, and he clutched his leg, which was bleeding profusely. Ben, what happened? I knelt beside him. Something attacked me, he gasped. It came out of nowhere. Maya ripped open her pack, pulling out a first aid kit. We need to stop the bleeding. As she worked, I scanned the surroundings. Did you see what it was? He winced. It was huge, like a wolf, but bigger, walked on two legs sometimes. A wolf on two legs? Maya exchanged a glance with me. Maybe you hit your head, I suggested gently. I'm not crazy, he snapped. It chased me, I think. I think it got Sarah. Sarah's out here too. Maya's voice tightened. She radioed for backup. I was closest, Ben explained. Great. So we're not just dealing with a rogue wildlife situation. I muttered. More like a nightmare, Ben said. We helped him to his feet. We need to get back. Can you walk? I'll manage. He grimaced. We made slow progress, the forest now cloaked in shadows. The rustling of leaves and snapping of twigs kept us on edge. Knock, knock, Maya whispered. Now's not the time, I hissed. Who's there? Ben played along, perhaps to distract himself from the pain. Interrupting Ranger. Whoa. Interrupting rang, she cut him off, holding up a hand. We fell silent. Ahead, the trees parted to reveal another clearing. In the center stood a figure, hunched over something on the ground. Is that Sarah? Ben whispered. I squinted. The figure was tall, its limbs too long, covered in matted fur that gleamed dully in the fading light. It resembled a bear crossed with a sloth, but grotesquely exaggerated. The creature lifted its head, revealing a snout filled with sharp teeth, blood dripping from its maw. That's definitely not Sarah, I said. The creature let out a sound, a mix between a howl and a roar, that sent chills through me. Run, Maya breathed. We backed away slowly, but Ben stumbled, his injured leg giving out. The creature's ears perked up, and it turned its gaze toward us. Go, I shouted, grabbing Ben under the arm. We bolted, adrenaline overriding fear. The creature crashed through the underbrush behind us, its heavy footfalls gaining. Any brilliant ideas? Maya shouted. Just one, I replied. Don't get caught. Solid plan. We burst into another clearing where an old fire tower stood. Up there, I pointed. We scrambled up the stairs, the metal structure shaking under our weight. Reaching the top, we pulled up the ladder. The creature circled below, glaring up with predatory eyes. It clawed at the tower's legs, causing the whole structure to sway. How long do you think this will hold? Ben asked, panting. Long enough for us to regret our life choices, Maya replied. I searched the small cabin. There's a flare gun here. Great. Maybe it enjoys fireworks, she said. Better than nothing. I loaded the flare gun, aiming down at the creature. Hey, ugly. It looked up, and I fired. The flare struck its shoulder, bursting into bright sparks. The creature howled in pain, retreating into the shadows. Well, that bought us time, Maya said. Time for what? We're still stuck up here, Ben pointed out. I grabbed the radio, hoping the altitude would help. Mayday, Mayday. This is Ranger Riley. We are under attack by an unknown creature. Request immediate assistance at the old fire tower near marker 12. End quote. Silence, then a crackle and a voice. Copy that, Riley. This is Johnson. Hold tight. We're dispatching a team. Thank God, Maya sighed. Minutes felt like hours as we waited. The creature was nowhere in sight, but the feeling of being watched remained. I once thought the scariest thing in these woods was a raccoon with an attitude, I said. Remind me to file a complaint about the lack of beware of monsters signs, Maya added. Sirens echoed in the distance, followed by the thumping of helicopter blades. A searchlight pierced through the canopy, sweeping over us. Over here, we waved frantically. The creature reappeared at the edge of the clearing, eyes reflecting the harsh light. It snarled before retreating once more. A team of rangers and local law enforcement arrived, weapons drawn. Are you all okay? Johnson shouted from below. Been better, I called back. But we're alive. They secured the area and helped us down. Paramedics tended to Ben's wounds. What the hell happened out there? Johnson demanded. I recounted the events as best as I could. Skepticism flashed across his face, but the evidence was hard to deny. Ben's injuries, the shredded campsite, the mauled deer. We'll conduct a full investigation, he said. In the meantime, you all need to get checked out. As we were escorted back, I couldn't shake the image of the creature. It was unlike anything documented. A new species, perhaps? Or something that defied explanation. Do you think it'll come back? Maya asked quietly. I don't know, I admitted. But I think we stirred up something best left alone. Back at the station, specialists were called in, wildlife experts, trackers, even a few suits from some government agency that wouldn't identify themselves. They spent days combing the area. I even caught sight of a few unmarked black SUVs parked near the entrance of the park a few days after our encounter. The whole thing gave me the creeps. Days later, they reported finding unusual tracks but no creature. The official statement labeled it a bear attack, exacerbated by hysteria and stress. Well, that's comforting, Maya remarked after reading the report. We're officially hysterical. At least they didn't blame it on swamp gas, I said. Ben healed up, though he decided to transfer to a desk job. Can't blame him. As for me, I stayed on. Someone had to keep an eye on things. And besides, I wasn't about to let some overgrown science experiment chase me off. One evening, a week after the incident, I was patrolling near the visitor center when a family approached me. "Excuse me," the father said. "Are there any bears we should worry about?" I smiled. "Just keep to the trails, and you'll be fine. The most dangerous thing you'll encounter is probably a squirrel with a nut allergy." They laughed, moving along. I glanced back toward the tree line. The forest stood serene, bathed in the golden hues of sunset. Whatever was out there, we'd be ready. The park never sleeps, and neither do the mysteries within it. All right, let me tell you. It was 2003, and being a park ranger in Michigan's Upper Peninsula ain't as peaceful as it sounds. My name's Dale Peterson, and I'd been working at the Ottawa National Forest for about 10 years at that point. You get used to seeing some strange stuff in the woods, but nothing really prepares you for the kind of mess I walked into that year. I always figured my worst days would involve lost campers or maybe the occasional bear encounter. Turns out I was way off. Now, most people think I'm joking when I say this, but the truth is, you gotta have a good sense of humor to survive out here. Otherwise, you'll start believing the forest is out to get you. I don't even carry a gun. Not because I'm some tree-hugging pacifist or anything, but mostly because I know myself too well. I'd probably end up shooting myself in the foot, fumbling for it in the dark. So, that day, a call came in about a couple of hikers who hadn't returned from their trail the night before. People go missing now and then, but they almost always turn up. They lose track of time, get caught up in the scenery, or decide to camp somewhere off the beaten path. This time, though, something felt different. I drove out to where their car was still parked, right at the edge of the wilderness. A beat-up Subaru with one of those old-school bumper stickers that said, "Life's an adventure." Yeah, well, not all adventures end with a selfie and a granola bar. The trail they'd taken wasn't too difficult. A steady climb, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the deeper I walked into the forest, the more uneasy I felt. It was too quiet. If you've ever spent time in the woods, you know it's never truly silent. There's always the wind, the creaking of trees, birds, and insects. But on that day, the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the underbrush. I tried to shake it off, blaming my nerves on a lack of coffee. After about an hour of hiking, I came across something that didn't sit right. A backpack, half torn to shreds, lying in the middle of the trail. Bits of food scattered around it. The wrapper from a protein bar hanging from a nearby branch. And there were tracks. Something big. Not bear big, though. These were wide but not deep. Like whatever made them had padded feet. I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but I'd never seen anything like it before. I pressed on, my heart beating faster than I'd like to admit. After another 15 minutes, I found them, or what was left of them. It was like a scene from a bad horror movie. The bodies were mangled, limbs at odd angles, blood soaked into the forest floor. One of them, a guy wearing a faded blue jacket, had his head twisted nearly off his shoulders. The other, a woman, was missing large chunks of flesh as if something had torn into her. Now, I've seen enough animal attacks to know what one looks like. But this wasn't right. The cuts were too clean, too precise. Like something with more intelligence than your average predator had done this. There were no signs of a struggle either. No claw marks in the dirt. no desperate scrawlings on the trees nearby. It was as if they had been caught off guard, completely unaware of what hit them. I took a step back, feeling bile rise in my throat, and that's when I heard it. A low, deep rumbling sound from the trees behind me. My first thought was mountain lion, but this wasn't that. It was bigger, heavier, the kind of sound that makes you freeze in place because every instinct you've got is screaming at you to run. Slowly I turned around, and that's when I saw it. Staring back at me from between the trees, about 30 feet away, was this thing. I don't even know how to describe it properly. It looked like a wolf, but not any kind of wolf I'd ever seen. Its fur was black, matted with dirt and blood, and it was easily the size of a grizzly bear. But its face, Jesus, its face was wrong. It had these elongated features, almost like it was trying to be human but hadn't quite figured out how. Its mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that didn't belong on any animal I knew of. It didn't move right away, just stood there watching me, like it was sizing me up. I didn't even dare breathe. Then, without warning, it charged. Now, I'm not a fast guy, I'll admit that. But when your life depends on it, you find a way to run faster than you ever thought possible. I took off down the trail, my boots slipping on the wet leaves, heart pounding in my ears. That thing was right behind me, close enough that I could hear its breath, hot and ragged. I don't know how I made it back to my truck, but I did. Threw myself inside, locked the doors, and slammed on the gas. I didn't stop until I was a good 10 miles out of that forest, shaking so hard I thought I might pass out. I reported the deaths, of course, but I didn't mention the creature. What the hell was I supposed to say? Hey boss, there's a mutant wolf beast thing hunting people in the woods. They'd laugh me out of the job. The bodies were taken out by the state police a few hours later, labeled as a freak bear attack. I didn't argue. Sometimes it's better to let people believe in the simple explanation. But here's the kicker. 2 weeks later, another couple went missing in the same area, same trail, same outcome. This time, though, there wasn't anything left of them, just a few scattered bones and bloodstains. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, threw myself into the more mundane aspects of the job. Lost hikers, campfire violations, the usual. But then, 2 weeks later, another couple went missing in the same area, same trail, same outcome. This time, though, there wasn't anything left of them, just a few scattered bones and bloodstains. I got the call, but I didn't go out there. I knew what I'd find, and I wasn't about to face that thing again. I don't work at Ottawa anymore. I left that job about a year after everything went down, moved to a desk job in the city, where the scariest thing I have to deal with is the traffic on the interstate. Sometimes, though, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still hear that creature's breath in the back of my mind, and I wonder how many more poor souls it's taken since then. But hey, on the bright side, at least I didn't have to outrun it for a second time. I like to think of that as my one big win in life. Better than winning the lottery, right? End of the day, I guess you could say I learned my lesson. Never trust the forest. It's got teeth you can't see, and it's always hungry. The mist hung low over the Tongass National Forest, cloaking the towering Sitka spruces in a ghostly shroud. I never imagined I'd trade the dry heat of Arizona for the damp chill of Alaska, But life has a funny way of turning the tables when you're not looking. My name's Miles Corbin, Miles for short. Back in 2019, I took up a post as a park ranger here in Tongass, the largest national forest in the United States. Fresh air, solitude, and a chance to escape a past that clung to me like tar. That was the dream. Funny how dreams and nightmares often share the same bed. I was always the guy who cracked jokes at the worst possible moments. Maybe it's a defense mechanism, or maybe I just enjoy the sound of groans more than laughter. Like I used to say, I'm not lazy. I'm on energy-saving mode. Not exactly stand-up material, but it kept things light during long patrols. That morning started like any other, a lukewarm cup of coffee and a stale bagel I wouldn't feed to a moose. The radio crackled to life. Miles, we've got reports of unauthorized hunters near the eastern perimeter, came Sarah's voice, sharp as ever. Copy that, heading there now. Now, if I don't make it back, tell my mom I finally learned how to fold a fitted sheet, I replied. Don't, she said dryly. Try not to start a war out there. I grabbed my gear and set off along the gravel path that wound through the forest like a serpent. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds chattered overhead, oblivious to the human concerns below. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something odd, a silence that pressed in like a held breath. The birds had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed to have taken leave. It reminded me of the calm before a storm, that pregnant pause where the world teeters on the edge of something unseen. I shrugged it off. Probably just my sparkling personality scaring them away, I muttered, continuing on. I spotted tracks veering off the main path. Boot prints, deep and erratic. They weren't part of any trail I knew, and curiosity got the better of me. Well, Miles, I said to myself, what's the worst that could happen? Famous last words. Following the prints, I entered a denser part of the forest where the canopy above knitted together, casting everything in perpetual twilight. The ground squished underfoot, and a faint odor hung in the air, metallic and sour. I came upon a clearing littered with the remains of a campsite, a torn tent, scattered belongings, and was that a shoe hanging from a branch? This doesn't scream happy campers, I said, a knot of unease tightening in my stomach. I radioed in. Sarah, you there? Found an abandoned campsite at grid reference 3, Alpha. Looks like it was ransacked. Static. Great. Of all days for technology to give me the cold shoulder. As I surveyed the wreckage, something caught my eye, a crude carving on a tree trunk. It resembled a wolf, but distorted, almost humanoid. Art critic I'm not, I muttered. But that's one ugly mural. A rustling sound pulled my attention. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. Hello? Park ranger here. If you're lost, I've got a map, and if you're hiding, I've got a very loud whistle. Silence. I walked toward where I thought I'd seen the movement. The underbrush was thick, resisting my every step. Pushing past a thicket, I nearly stumbled into a small pit. At first glance, it looked like a sinkhole, but then I noticed the bones, animal bones, I hoped, scattered at the bottom. Well, that's not foreboding at all, I whispered. A low chuckle echoed behind me. I spun around, heart pounding. Who's there? Nothing. Okay, Miles. Either you're losing it, or someone's playing a very unfunny prank. I decided it was time to head back. As I retraced my steps, the forest seemed unfamiliar, as if the trees had shifted in my absence. After what felt like an hour, I realized I was going in circles. Panic started to bubble up, but I pushed it down. Lost in the woods, every park ranger's secret shame, I muttered. I tried the radio again. "Sarah, do you copy?" This time, a garbled voice came through. "Miles, get out." "Sarah? Repeat that." "You're breaking up." "Not alone." "Run." The line went dead. Well, that's sufficiently creepy. A sudden scream pierced the air, a man's voice filled with terror. Without thinking, I ran toward the sound, breaking through a dense patch of ferns. I entered another clearing. The sight stopped me cold. A fellow ranger, a guy named Kevin, his body torn apart, eyes wide in a lifeless stare. Blood soaked the moss beneath him, and deep gashes crisscrossed his torso. "Oh no, Kevin." I felt a surge of nausea but forced it down. A guttural sound rumbled nearby. Emerging from behind a fallen log was a creature unlike anything I'd ever imagined. It stood on two legs, towering over me by at least 3 feet. Its body was covered in matted fur, patches of which were missing to reveal slick gray skin. The face was elongated, like a deer's but twisted, with sharp antlers that branched out like gnarled fingers. "Well, that's not Bambi," I said, stepping back slowly. The creature tilted its head, black eyes reflecting no light. It sniffed the air and bared a set of jagged teeth. I glanced at Kevin's body and then back at the beast. "Look, if this is about trespassing, I can leave. No hard feelings." It let out a shriek that rattled my teeth and lunged forward. I dove to the side, feeling its claws graze my arm, a burning slash that seared instantly. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted. Adrenaline surged, and the forest became a blur of green and brown. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground. "Come on, Miles, think," I hissed between ragged breaths. Up ahead, I spotted a narrow ravine. Without hesitation, I leaped across, landing hard on the other side. The creature skidded to a halt at the edge, snarling. "What's the matter? Can't jump?" "Guess those legs are all for show," I shouted, my bravado thin and cracking. It paced along the ravine's edge, eyes never leaving me. I took the moment to assess my options. The pain in my arm was sharp, blood seeping through my torn sleeve. Reaching into my pack, I pulled out a flare. Not exactly a lightsaber, but it'll have to do. I ignited it. The red flame sputtered to life. The creature recoiled slightly. "Ah, so you're not a fan of fireworks." I waved the flare, trying to keep the ravine between us. Slowly I backed away, but my foot caught on a root and I fell hard, the flare rolling out of reach. "Smooth move," I groaned. The beast seized the opportunity, leaping over the gap effortlessly. It stood over me, drool dripping from its maw. "Wait, aren't you supposed to be scared of fire?" I stammered. It snapped its jaws inches from my face. Desperate, I grabbed a handful of dirt and threw it into its eyes. It howled, stumbling back. Seizing the moment, I got to my feet and ran toward a cluster of old mining shacks I remembered from maps, abandoned but potentially offering shelter. Reaching the first shack, I slammed the door behind me. The structure was rickety, walls full of gaps, but it was something. I searched frantically for anything useful. In a corner I found a rusted pickaxe. Not exactly state-of-the-art weaponry, but beggars can't be choosers. The door shook as the creature slammed against it. Wood splintered, and I knew it wouldn't hold. "Come on in, mi casa es su casa," I shouted, positioning myself. The door gave way, and the beast charged. I swung the pickaxe with everything I had. It connected with a sickening thud, lodging into the creature's shoulder. It roared in pain, swiping at me and sending me crashing into the wall. Stars exploded in my vision, but I held on to consciousness. The beast struggled, the pickaxe hindering its movement. Seizing the chance, I crawled toward a stack of old dynamite sticks, probably unstable but better than nothing. "Time to bring down the house," I mumbled. I grabbed a stick, lit it with the lighter I always kept a habit from my smoking days, and tossed it at the creature's feet, diving out a side window. I hit the ground as an explosion ripped through the air. Debris flew, and a wave of heat washed over me. Coughing, I got up and looked back at the wreckage. Smoke billowed, and flames licked at the remains of the shack. There was no movement. "Guess that blew your mind," I said weakly. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup had finally arrived, or maybe someone had reported the explosion. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "Miles, what's your status? We heard an explosion. Alive, for now. Send medical to my coordinates. Kevin is down. There's something else out here." "Understood. Help is on the way." Minutes later, a team arrived. They found me disheveled and bleeding but alive. Kevin's body was recovered, and the area was secured. "Did you see what did this?" one of the officers asked. I hesitated. It was a bear, had to be. He gave me a skeptical look but didn't press further. Days later, I sat in the station, arm bandaged, sipping terrible coffee. Reports came in of strange sightings, but nothing concrete. The official story remained a wild animal attack. Sarah approached me. "You sure you're okay?" "Never better. Just another day in paradise." She sat down. "You know, if there's more to this." I cut her off. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep. You might not like what you find." She nodded slowly. "Fair enough." As I left the station that evening, the shadows stretched long under the fading light. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, hidden somewhere among the trees. "Well, if you're out there, at least buy me dinner first." I called out to the empty forest. A rustling sounded, but it was just a deer stepping into the clearing. It looked at me briefly before darting away. I chuckled softly. Jumpier than I am, that's a first. Climbing into my truck, I took one last look at the tree line before driving off. Some secrets the forest could keep. I'd had enough adventure to last a lifetime, or at least until my next cup of coffee. Back in 2001, I found myself working as a ranger at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. You'd think the biggest threat to a ranger would be a bear or some overzealous camper picking a fight over regulations. But the truth is, if I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods, I'd have quit my job on the spot. My name's Jack Stratton, by the way. I wasn't one of those kids who always dreamed of becoming a ranger. Honestly, I stumbled into it after a brief career in construction didn't pan out. Turns out, swinging hammers wasn't my thing, and the peace of the woods sounded like an upgrade from city life. Now, 8 years into the job, I can say it's been both the best and the worst decision I ever made. Shenandoah National Park is vast. Over 200,000 acres of forest, rivers, and trails winding through the Blue Ridge Mountains. If you don't know what you're doing, you can get lost in minutes. Lucky for me, I had a knack for navigation and had always found my way around pretty easily. But what happened on that day wasn't about getting lost. It was about something finding us. It started out as any other shift, really. We had a report of a missing hiker, a college kid named Noah Collins. He'd been out on the old Rag Mountain Trail and hadn't returned after sundown. That's a big no-no, especially for inexperienced hikers. This trail had a reputation for being tricky, steep, and sometimes unforgiving, particularly in bad weather. I teamed up with two other rangers, Sarah Jenkins and Tom Miller. Both were seasoned rangers, solid on their feet. We loaded up the gear, flashlights, rope, first aid kits, the usual, and hiked up the old Rag Trail. At first, we figured it was a typical case of someone going off trail, getting disoriented, or maybe twisting an ankle. Worst case scenario, Noah had found himself stuck in one of the rock scrambles that littered the higher parts of the mountain. But something was off. The air felt different, like there was something hanging in it, something that didn't belong. We reached the main trailhead by early afternoon, but the moment we set foot past the initial tree line, there was this awful stench, like decaying meat, hanging heavy in the air. Sarah wrinkled her nose. "That's never a good sign," she muttered, glancing around. We pushed forward, keeping our voices low, listening for any sound that might indicate Noah's location. We called out his name a few times, but the echoes seemed to die faster than usual, like the trees were swallowing the sound. Tom, ever the optimist, joked that we were chasing Bigfoot, but none of us laughed. The sun was already dipping low by the time we made it to the first rock scramble. That's when we found the first sign something wasn't right. There, half buried under some leaves, was a torn backpack. The fabric was shredded, not like it had caught on a branch or rock, but like something had clawed it open. There were deep gashes in the fabric, each one lined with something like dried blood. Sarah knelt down, picking it up and turning it over in her hands. "I think this is Noah's," she said, her voice low. I radioed back to the station, letting them know we'd found what looked like Noah's pack. But there was no sign of the kid himself. Protocol meant we had to keep going. No turning back until we found more evidence or, God forbid, a body. So we pressed on, the uneasy feeling growing with every step. The further we went, the more signs we found. Broken branches, scuffed marks on the rocks, more bloodstains. And the smell was getting worse. It wasn't just rot anymore. There was a sourness to it, like something festering, growing rancid in the cold autumn air. Tom was the first to see it. He stopped dead in his tracks, shining his flashlight ahead. "What the hell?" he whispered, barely audible. Sarah and I followed his gaze, and that's when we saw it too. There, caught between the crevices of two large boulders, was something I wish I could unsee. A body, what was left of it anyway. It was Noah, or at least it had been. His torso had been ripped open, his limbs. I'm not sure where they were. The body looked like it had been chewed on, chunks of flesh missing. There were these strange markings all over his skin, like claw marks, but too deep, too wide for anything I'd seen before in the park. Sarah gagged, turning away, and even Tom, who'd seen his fair share of injuries and accidents, looked like he might lose his lunch. We didn't have long to process the horror. From somewhere up ahead, there was a noise, low and guttural, not animal, but not human either. I froze, my blood turning cold as I strained to figure out what it was. Tom grabbed the flashlight, shining it in the direction of the sound. Whatever it was close. I've been around bears before, even had a close call with a mountain lion once, but this was different. This was a predator, a real one, and it was hunting us. Sarah and Tom were already backing away, but before I could join them, the thing stepped into the light. It wasn't a bear, not by a long shot. It stood on 4 legs, but its limbs were elongated, almost disproportionate, like it had adapted for running in a strange, distorted way. Its skin was mottled, dark and slick, glistening in the flashlight's beam like wet leather. It had these grotesque jaws, too wide for its head, filled with sharp, uneven teeth. If I had to compare it to anything, it was like a hyena but larger, more twisted, like something pulled from a nightmare. I don't know if it was the fear or the shock, but we stood there, frozen, staring at this creature as it stared back at us. Its breath was visible in the cold air, every exhale sounding like a hiss. Then, without warning, it charged. Tom shouted, pulling out his service revolver. I heard 2 shots, loud, reverberating off the rocks, but the thing didn't stop. It was on him in seconds, knocking him down. The sound of bones snapping was like nothing I'd ever heard, worse than any movie could make it sound. He screamed once, but it was cut short as the creature bit down on his throat, tearing it apart. Sarah ran. I didn't blame her. Hell, I wanted to run too, but I couldn't leave Tom. Not like that, not to this thing. I grabbed a rock, the only thing I could find, and threw it at the creature. It was a stupid move, but it worked. It snapped its head up, snarling at me, before bounding off into the trees, dragging Tom's body with it. For a moment, I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to follow Sarah, to run, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't, not yet, not until I was sure that thing was gone. When I finally turned, I saw that Sarah was long gone. I scrambled down the rocks, nearly losing my footing several times in the fading light. The trail was a blur, the trees twisting around me as I stumbled forward, trying to remember the way back. The smell of blood still lingered in the air, sharp and acrid. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I made it to a clearing. There was Sarah, huddled next to a boulder, shaking. We didn't say anything for a moment, just catching our breath, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Sarah was the first to speak. We need to get back to the station now. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. But even as we made our way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being followed. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch sent adrenaline spiking through my veins. When we finally reached the ranger station, I called it in, told them what we'd found, what had happened to Tom. They didn't believe me at first, who would? But when the backup team found Noah's body and the blood trail leading deeper into the woods, they couldn't deny it anymore. Something was out there, something deadly. They sent in a search party the next day to recover Tom's body. All they found were bones, scattered across the rocks, stripped clean. I don't work at Shenandoah anymore. Got out of that job a few months later. Now I'm back in construction. It's safer, well, except for the occasional nail gun incident. And when people ask why I left the park, I just tell them I'm not cut out for the woods. I never mentioned the creature. No one would believe me anyway. But, I can't help but think back on that thing we saw. I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, feeding, waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander into its hunting grounds. And, you know what? I hope it never finds me again. I never thought much about solitude until I took the assignment at Denali National Park in Alaska back in 2011. My name's Jake Collins, and I've been a park ranger for a few years now. The vast expanse of wilderness up here is something that both humbles and exhilarates you. There's a kind of quiet that settles into your bones, a stillness that's hard to find anywhere else. I grew up in a small town in Maine, where the tallest thing around was the church steeple. The forests there were nothing compared to the endless stretches of pine and tundra in Denali. I moved here looking for a change of pace, maybe even a bit of adventure. On my days off, I'd hike trails that hadn't seen footprints in weeks, fishing rod in hand, hoping to catch dinner and a good story. One morning I was assigned to check on some remote cabins used by researchers during the summer months. Winter was closing in, and we needed to make sure everything was secured before the heavy snows made the area inaccessible. My colleague Sarah Miller was supposed to join me, but she called in sick with the flu. So I packed up my gear, loaded the snowmobile, and headed out alone. The ride out was smooth enough. The sky was a pale gray, the kind that makes you wonder if the sun ever truly rises here. The trees stood tall and silent, their branches weighed down by fresh snow. Occasionally, I'd spot a hare darting across the white canvas or catch the distant call of a raven. After a couple of hours, I reached the first cabin. Everything seemed in order, windows locked, no signs of forced entry, supplies untouched. I noted it all on my checklist and moved on to the next one, about 5 miles deeper into the woods. As I approached the second cabin, something felt off. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the icy breeze. I parked the snowmobile and approached cautiously. "Hello? Anyone here?" I called out, half expecting a fellow ranger or maybe a lost hiker seeking shelter. There was no reply. Inside, the cabin was in disarray. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and a strange, musky odor permeated the air. It smelled like damp earth mixed with something metallic. I pulled out my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Claw marks, etched deep into the wooden walls, caught my eye. 3 parallel lines, too wide for a bear and too deep for a wolverine. I radioed back to the station. "This is Jake at cabin 2. I've got signs of forced entry and possible animal activity. Over." Static was my only answer. I checked the device, tapped it a few times, but the signal was dead. "Great," I muttered. "Just great." Stepping back outside, I decided to inspect the perimeter. The snow around the cabin was disturbed, but not in any way I could easily read. The tracks were erratic, overlapping, and unlike any animal prints I had seen before. They were large, almost oval, with what seemed like 4 toes ending in sharp indentations, claws maybe. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. A joke came to mind about how I moved to the coldest place possible to avoid getting cold feet, but it fell flat, even in my thoughts. Determined to finish my duty, I decided to head to the third and final cabin, about 7 miles further in. If something dangerous was out here, I needed to know. The trail was rougher, less maintained. Branches reached out like skeletal hands, scraping against my jacket as I pushed through. About halfway there, the snowmobile sputtered and came to a halt. I tried the ignition, nothing. Out of fuel. Should have checked the gauge, genius. I scolded myself. I weighed my options. Turning back would mean trekking several miles on foot, but pressing on to the next cabin would at least offer shelter and possibly a working radio. I grabbed my backpack, tightened the straps, and moved forward. The forest grew denser, the trees crowding together as if sharing secrets. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots against the snow. Then, in the distance, I heard a sound, faint but distinct, a sort of chittering like the murmurs of a crowd heard through a wall. I paused, straining to listen. The noise stopped, shrugging it off as the wind. I continued. But the sound picked up again, louder this time, seeming to come from all around me. I couldn't pinpoint a direction. It was disorienting, like being in a room with speakers hidden in every corner. "Hello? Is someone out there?" My voice sounded small amidst the towering pines. No answer came, but the noise ceased once more. I felt uneasy, like I was the punchline in a joke I didn't understand. I picked up the pace, eager to reach the cabin before nightfall. As the light began to fade, I finally saw the outline of the third cabin. Relief washed over me. The structure looked intact. Smoke even wafted gently from the chimney. Maybe someone's home, I thought. I knocked on the door. "Anyone in there?" "This is Ranger Jake Collins." Silence. I tried the handle. It turned easily. Stepping inside, warmth greeted me, along with the comforting crackle of a fire. But the cabin appeared empty. A pot of something aromatic simmered over the hearth. On the table sat a mug of steaming tea. The whole scene was unsettling, like arriving late to a party where everyone had just stepped out. "Hello?" I called again, more cautiously. Then I saw it, a notebook lying open on the desk, pages filled with hurried handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me. I approached and began to read. Day 12. The creature is more intelligent than we thought. It watches, studies. Last night, it mimicked Jacob's voice. We almost opened the door. I flipped back a page. Day 11. We've barricaded the doors and windows. Food supplies are low. The radio isn't working. Sarah is starting to panic. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't a research team I was aware of. I turned another page. Day 13. If you're reading this, we didn't make it. The creature can imitate sounds, perhaps even voices. Do not trust anything you hear outside. Do not go into the woods at night. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. I froze. "Jake, is that you?" A woman's voice called out, Sarah's voice. My mind raced. Sarah was sick, back at the station, over 30 miles away. There was no way she could be here. "Jake, please, open the door. I need help." I backed away, heart pounding. The door rattled as the knocking grew more insistent. "Let me in. It's cold out here." I glanced around for a weapon, anything. Grabbing a fireplace poker, I positioned myself near the back of the cabin. The door handle twisted slowly. I watched in horror as it opened, revealing not Sarah, but something else entirely. It stood upright, like a human, but was covered in coarse matted fur. Its face was elongated, resembling that of a hyena, but with patches of bare skin, stretched tight over protruding bones. Sharp teeth glinted as it pulled back cracked lips into a grotesque approximation of a smile. It stepped inside, moving with an unnatural grace. The creature tilted its head, eyes reflecting the firelight with a predatory gleam. "Stay back," I shouted, brandishing the poker. It opened its mouth, and Sarah's voice came out. "Jake, it's me. Don't you recognize me?" A twisted sense of anger bubbled up. "That's not funny." The creature took another step forward. Without thinking, I swung the poker. It connected with a dull thud against the creature's arm. It let out a sound, a mix between a laugh and a snarl that sent a shiver down my spine. It lunged at me, and we both fell to the floor. Its claws tore at my jacket, narrowly missing flesh. The stench of its breath was overpowering, a foul mix of decay and damp earth. I kicked upwards, pushing it off me. Scrambling to my feet, I made a dash for the door. The creature was fast, but the cluttered cabin slowed it down. Bursting outside, I ran blindly into the woods. Behind me, the creature gave chase, crashing through the underbrush. The fading light made it difficult to see, but I didn't dare slow down. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step. Ahead, I spotted a narrow ravine. Without time to think, I leaped across, barely making it to the other side. I heard the creature skid to a halt behind me. For a moment, there was silence. Then it began to mimic again. This time it was my own voice. "Help! Somebody, help me!" The effect was unnerving. Hearing my own pleas echoed back at me almost made me stop, but I pressed on. After what felt like hours, I emerged into a clearing. Moonlight illuminated an old maintenance shed we hadn't used in years. I ducked inside, bolting the door behind me. The shed was small, filled with rusted tools and old equipment. I searched frantically for anything useful. In the corner, I found a flare gun with one shot left. A scratching sound came from the door. Then the creature spoke in another voice. My father's, whom I hadn't seen in years. "Son, open up. It's okay." My hand shook as I loaded the flare gun. "You're not real," I whispered. The door creaked as the creature began to force its way in. Wood splinters flew as its claws tore through. As it squeezed through the gap, I fired the flare gun. The bright light hit the creature square in the chest, igniting its fur. It let out a shriek, unlike anything I'd ever heard, thrashing wildly as flames consumed it. Seizing the moment, I kicked open a loose plank on the side of the shed and slipped out. The creature was distracted, giving me a precious few minutes to put distance between us. I stumbled upon an old service trail and followed it until I saw headlights in the distance. A park maintenance truck was idling, two rangers inside finishing up their rounds. Waving my arms, I shouted, "Hey, over here!" They saw me and pulled up. "Jake, what the hell happened to you?" One of them, Mark, asked, eyes wide. "There's something out there. We need to get back to the station now." They didn't ask any more questions. sensing the urgency in my voice. As we drove away, I glanced back toward the tree line. For a brief moment I thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting in the darkness, but it could have been a trick of the light. Back at the station, I reported everything. A search team was dispatched, but they found no trace of the creature, just the burned remains of the shed and strange tracks that led nowhere. Officially, it was written off as a bear attack, with the fire attributed to a faulty propane tank. Unofficially, those of us who knew kept a wary eye on the woods. A week later, a group of hikers went missing in the same area. Their bodies were found days later, showing signs of an animal attack, though the details didn't add up. The patterns were too erratic, the injuries unlike those from any known predator. The park was temporarily closed for investigation. Specialists were brought in, but no definitive answers emerged. As for me, I took some time off. The wilderness that once felt like home now seemed alien. Every rustling leaf, a potential threat. Before I left, I installed additional warning signs around the perimeter of that section of the park. One of the maintenance guys laughed, saying I was being overly cautious. Better safe than sorry, I replied with a half smile. As I packed up my truck to leave, Mark approached me. Heading out? Just for a bit, I said. Take care of yourself, Jake. We'll hold down the fort. I nodded. Keep an eye out, okay? He gave me a curious look, but didn't press further. Driving away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something old and cunning was out there, something that didn't appreciate uninvited guests. The park remains one of the most beautiful places I've ever known, but beauty often hides secrets best left undisturbed. My name is Jake, and I've seen some things. Things that'd make your skin crawl and your hair stand on end. And let me tell you, nothing can quite prepare you for the kind of messed up stuff that went down in Alaska in 2017. See, I was a park ranger in Tongass National Forest. Figured swapping the city's constant noise for the quiet whisper of pine trees was a sweet deal, especially for a guy whose jokes are usually only appreciated by squirrels, literally. My days were a mix of boring patrols and the occasional rescue of some city slicker who thought their fancy GPS was smarter than Mother Nature. Life was simple, you know. Just me, the trees, and the vast, rugged wilderness. A good day meant the biggest thrill was a moose blocking the path, acting like he owned the place. One morning I met up with my partner Rick, a guy who could somehow brew the worst coffee known to man. You look like you wrestled a bear and lost, he quipped, handing me a steaming mug that smelled suspiciously like burnt tires. Thanks, Rick. Nothing like your coffee to remind me why I love being alone, I shot back, forcing a smile. We were supposed to check on a remote campsite where some scientists were collecting dirt samples. They hadn't radioed in for 2 days, which wasn't totally unheard of. But still, it was our job to check it out. We hopped on the ATV, the engine's roar shattering the morning quiet. As we bumped along the winding paths, Rick, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. Why did the mushroom get invited to all the parties? He asked. I sighed. I don't know, Rick, why. Because he was a fungi, he chuckled. I groaned. You're a walking advertisement for solitude, you know that? The trail narrowed, and the trees overhead got thicker, casting this crazy quilt of light and shadow on the forest floor. A weird feeling started crawling up my spine, but I figured it was just Rick's bad joke lingering in the air. When we got to the campsite, things were off. Tents were half collapsed. Gear was scattered everywhere like someone had left in a hurry. "Hello? Dr. Miller? Anybody here?" I called out. Only silence answered. Rick frowned. "Maybe they went for a hike without their stuff?" "Doubt it," I said. We decided to split up and look around. I went over to one of the tents and saw these huge gashes in the fabric, like something with giant claws had ripped right through it. Inside, sleeping bags were shredded, and personal belongings were tossed around. "Rick, you gotta see this," I yelled. He jogged over, his face going pale as he took in the scene. "What the hell could have done this?" he whispered. "A bear?" I shook my head. Bears don't usually tear through tents unless there's food, and even then, this is too much. A metallic smell hung in the air like copper. It made my stomach churn. I followed the smell to the edge of the campsite and found a patch of ground stained dark. I knelt down. It was blood. "Rick, we have a problem," I said, my voice low. He joined me, his eyes wide. "We need to radio this in," he said. I reached for my radio, but all I got was static. "Figures. Signal's blocked out here. We'll have to head back," I said. As we turned to leave, a rustling sound caught our attention. About 20 yards away, the bushes shook. "Did you see that?" Rick whispered. "Probably just the wind," I replied, but my heart was racing. Since when does the wind have footsteps? We stood there listening. The forest, usually buzzing with birds and critters, was dead silent. "Let's not stick around to find out," I suggested. We started walking back toward the ATV, quickening our pace. That's when it came out of the trees. At first I thought it was some kind of oversized wolverine, but it was all wrong. It stood on its hind legs, towering over us by at least a foot. Matted fur, long limbs ending in claws that looked sharp enough to carve stone, and eyes that were just empty. "Is that some kind of mutant bear?" Rick stammered. "I don't think so," I replied, taking a slow step back. The thing tilted its head, studying us. Then it opened its mouth, showing rows of jagged teeth that made me regret every dentist appointment I'd ever skipped. "Slowly, back away," I told Rick. But he panicked. "Too late for that," he yelled and bolted. The creature lunged at him with terrifying speed. I watched in horror as it swiped at Rick, its claws tearing through his back like it was made of paper. He went down with a choked cry. "Rick!" I shouted, adrenaline flooding my system. I grabbed a fallen branch, hardly a weapon, but better than nothing, and swung it at the creature as it turned toward me. The wood connected with a dull thud against its shoulder, barely making it flinch. "Great plan, Jake," I muttered to myself, desperate. I threw a rock at its head. This time, it let out a screech that rattled my eardrums. Seizing the moment, I sprinted toward the ATV. I had the keys, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get them out of my pocket. Come on, I urged myself, finally jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I glanced back. The creature was standing over Rick's body. It looked at me, then started bounding in my direction. Time to go. I slammed the accelerator, the ATV lurching forward. The path was rough, and the ATV bounced violently as I navigated the twists and turns. The creature was fast, too fast. It was gaining on me, its leaps covering huge distances. Up ahead, a fallen tree blocked the trail. "You've got to be kidding me," I groaned. No time to stop. I veered sharply off the path, plunging into the thick woods. Branches whipped at my face, and the ATV struggled over the rough terrain. Behind me, the creature screeched again, closer now. I spotted a narrow gap between two huge boulders. A tight squeeze, but maybe my only chance. I aimed for it, the sides of the ATV scraping against the rocks as I squeezed through. The creature, bigger than the ATV, slammed into the boulders with a sickening crunch. "Physics for the win," I muttered, not slowing down. I hit a wider trail and gunned it toward the ranger station. When I saw the building, relief washed over me. I skidded to a halt, jumped off the ATV, and burst inside, slamming the door behind me. "Mayday! This is Ranger Thompson, requesting immediate assistance," I yelled into the radio. Static. "Not now." I smacked the radio, and a faint voice crackled through. "Repeat your message, Thompson. Creature attack at Grid Inn. Rick is down. I need backup and medical. Now," I shouted. "Copy that. Help is on the way." I locked all the doors and windows and grabbed the rifle from the emergency locker. My heart was pounding. Only 5 rounds. Gotta make 'em count. The windows rattled as something heavy slammed against the side of the station. I took cover behind a desk, aiming at the door. A moment of silence, then the sound of claws scraping against wood. The door creaked, the hinges straining. "Knock, knock," I whispered, trying to steady my shaking hands. The door burst open, splinters flying. The creature stood there, even more terrifying up close. I fired. The bullet hit its shoulder. It recoiled, but it didn't go down. "Guess you're not a fan of lead," I said, firing again. This shot hit its leg, and it let out a guttural snarl. It charged at me, and I barely dodged as it swiped at the air where my head had been seconds before. I scrambled behind a filing cabinet. "Any chance we can talk this out?" I called out, knowing it probably couldn't understand me, or maybe it just didn't care. The creature was tearing the place apart, looking for me. I could hear its heavy breathing, a raspy sound that echoed in the small room. 2 bullets left. I needed a plan. Then it hit me. The propane tank in the supply closet. That could be my way out. I started inching toward the closet, staying low. The creature was methodically destroying everything. I reached the tank and waited for the right moment. "Hey, over here," I shouted. The creature turned, locking onto me. As it lunged, I aimed and fired at the propane tank. The explosion was deafening. The blast threw me backward, and I felt the searing heat as flames engulfed the room. Debris rained down and smoke filled the air. Coughing, I pulled myself up. The creature was lying in the wreckage, charred and still. "Looks like you couldn't handle the heat," I said weakly. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup had arrived. Paramedics patched me up while firefighters put out the flames. Chief Miller approached, his face a mix of concern and disbelief. "What happened here, Thompson?" he asked. I looked at the smoldering ruins of the station. "Had a bit of a pest problem," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Rick," I swallowed hard. "He didn't make it." He put a hand on my shoulder. "We'll find out what did this," he said. "Good luck with that," I replied. knowing they'd have a hard time explaining what was left of that thing. In the end, they called it a freak accident, a gas leak that caused an explosion. They said Rick was killed by a wild animal, probably a bear. I knew the truth, but some truths are just too crazy to believe. As for me, I figured it was time for a career change. Maybe something indoors, where the wildest thing you encounter is a paper jam. Who knew that swapping jokes with squirrels would one day seem like the good old days? There's this weird kind of silence you only get deep in the woods, the kind that makes you wonder if you've ever really known quiet before. My name is Ethan Hayes, and back in 2015, I was a park ranger in the Allagash National Forest in Pennsylvania. I'd always found peace among the trees, maybe because they don't judge you for being a man of few words. After 10 years in the Marines, I figured trading deserts and mountains for forests would be a nice, easy change. I thought being a park ranger would be like early retirement, swapping my rifle for a radio and my helmet for a wide-brimmed hat. Most days, that's exactly what it was. I'd patrol the trails, help out the occasional lost hiker, and spend my evenings reading by the campfire. My coworker Sarah and I even had a running joke that the most dangerous thing in these woods was the coffee in the station's break room. But one autumn day, that all changed. It was late October, the kind of day where the leaves are all blazing reds and oranges, and the air smells like winter's on its way. I was sent to check out a report of illegal hunting in the northern part of the park, a place we locals called the Deep Green because the trees are so thick. Sarah was supposed to come with me, but she called in sick with the flu. "Don't have too much fun without me," she joked over the phone. Heading out alone wasn't a big deal. Solitude had its perks. No small talk, no distractions, just me and the forest. I grabbed my gear, radio, map, first aid kit, and for once, I decided to take the old Winchester rifle from the equipment locker. Regulations allowed us to carry firearms when investigating potential poaching. Better safe than sorry, I thought. As I got deeper into the deep green, I noticed the usual forest sounds seemed muted. No birds singing, no rustling of animals in the bushes. It reminded me of the quiet before a storm, that eerie stillness that makes the hairs on your neck stand up. I shrugged it off, blaming it on the changing seasons. About an hour into my hike, I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks, an abandoned campsite. The tent was shredded, sleeping bags torn apart, and supplies scattered everywhere. It looked like a tornado had hit, but we didn't get tornadoes in this part of Pennsylvania. I radioed back to the station. "Control, this is Ethan. I've found a trashed campsite at grid reference D16. No sign of the campers. Only static answered." Great. The radio was acting up again. I made a mental note to give Sarah an "I told you so" about those budget cuts affecting our gear. With no way to call in, I decided to investigate further. There were footprints leading away from the campsite, all over the place like whoever made them was running. They were deep, too, suggesting someone carrying weight or moving in a panic. I followed them, the forest getting denser with each step. Then I found the first body. It was a man, probably in his mid-30s. His clothes were torn, and his body, well, let's just say I'd seen less gruesome stuff on the battlefield. deep cuts all over his body, and his face was frozen in this look of pure terror. I'd seen death before, but this was something else. I checked for a pulse, just going through the motions, knowing there wouldn't be one. I tried the radio again. "Control, this is Ethan. I have a deceased male at grid reference D8. Possible animal attack. Request immediate backup." Again, just static. I needed to get back and report this, but something made me keep going. Maybe it was the footprints leading further into the woods, or maybe it was that sense of duty drilled into me from years of service. About 50 yards ahead, I found a second body, a woman this time. Same horrible injuries, same terrified expression. I'd seen enough. This wasn't the work of any animal I knew of. Cougars hadn't been seen here in decades, and black bears didn't attack humans unprovoked. I decided to head back, but as I turned around, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone. It was a low rumble, like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. I gripped the rifle tighter, scanning the trees. Then I saw it. At first I thought it was some kind of huge wolverine, but standing upright on its hind legs, towering at least 7 feet tall. I blinked, thinking I was seeing things. I'd never seen anything like it. Its fur was matted and dark, with patches missing to show the tough, sinewy muscle underneath. Its claws were long and sharp, glinting even in the dim light. It stared at me, head tilted, like it was sizing me up. My training kicked in. I raised the rifle, aiming center mass. I didn't want to shoot, but whatever this thing was, it had already killed 2 people. I shouted, "Stay back." It responded by showing a set of teeth that would make a grizzly bear look harmless. I fired a warning shot into the air. The creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it charged. Time seemed to slow down. I fired again, aiming at the creature. The bullet hit it square in the shoulder, but it only seemed to make it angrier. It closed the distance faster than I thought possible. I dove to the side as it swiped at me, its claws tearing through my jacket and grazing my skin. The pain was sharp, but adrenaline kept me moving. I scrambled to my feet, chambering another round. I fired again, hitting it in the leg this time. It stumbled, giving me a few precious seconds. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life, dodging between trees, leaping over roots. The forest I'd found so comforting now felt like a maze trying to trap me. I could hear it crashing through the bushes behind me. Desperate, I spotted a narrow crevice between 2 large boulders. I squeezed myself into it, the rock scraping against my back. Holding my breath, I waited. I could hear it approaching, sniffing the air. It let out another one of those unsettling sounds, somewhere between a roar and a snarl. It was so close I could smell its foul breath, a mix of decay and raw meat. It clawed at the entrance of the crevice, but it was too big to reach me. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I needed a plan. Then I remembered the flare gun in my pack. With shaky hands I pulled it out. If I could distract it long enough, maybe I could make a run for it. I fired the flare in the opposite direction. The sudden burst of light startled the creature. It turned toward the flare, giving me the opening I needed. I bolted from the crevice, running in the direction I hoped was back toward the station. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could hear it chasing me again. Breaking through a stand of trees, I spotted the old fire lookout tower. If I could get inside and lock the door, maybe I could call for help. I dashed up the stairs 2 at a time, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it and pushed a heavy cabinet in front of it. Searching the room, I found the old radio equipment. With a silent prayer, I flipped the switch. Static crackled. Then a voice came through. "This is Ranger Station Alpha. Identify yourself." "This is Ethan Hayes. I'm at the old lookout tower near the deep green. I need immediate assistance. There's something out here. 2 civilians are dead." "Copy that, Ethan. Hold tight. We're sending a team to your location." Just then, the whole tower shook. The creature was ramming itself against the supports. Wood creaked and groaned under the assault. I could see it from the window, circling the base, looking for a way up. I wasn't safe yet. An idea struck me. The tower had an old fuel tank for the generator. If I could light it, maybe I could take the creature out. I grabbed a spare rope, tied it to the railing, and secured the other end around my waist. I prepared to rappel down the opposite side of the tower. It was risky, but staying put wasn't an option. I climbed down as quietly as I could. Once on the ground, I moved quickly to the fuel tank. I opened the valve, letting the gasoline spill out, making a trail leading toward the base of the tower. Taking a deep breath, I lit a match and dropped it onto the fuel. Flames erupted, racing along the ground. The creature turned toward the fire. For a moment, it seemed confused. Then the fire reached the tank. The explosion was deafening. The force knocked me off my feet. Debris flew everywhere. When the dust settled, the tower was engulfed in flames, and the creature was nowhere to be seen. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was finally arriving. I sat there, covered in dirt and ash, as the first responders pulled up. They asked questions, but I didn't have any answers that would make sense. They found the bodies of the 2 hikers. An investigation started, but they never found any trace of the creature. The official report called it a tragic accident caused by a rogue animal. New rules were put in place, and the area was marked as off-limits until they knew more. Back at the station, Sarah was back from being sick. "Leave it to you to turn a routine patrol into a fireworks show," she teased. "Just trying to keep things interesting," I replied. She smirked. "Next time, maybe warn me before you decide to remodel the forest." "I'll put it on my to-do list," I said with a shrug. Work went on as usual. The incident became a kind of urban legend among the rangers. Some believed my story, others thought I'd spent too much time alone in the woods. Either way, the forest felt a little different after that. Life at the park went back to its normal rhythm. Hikers came and went, the leaves changed and fell, and winter snow covered the deep green. The memory of that day stayed with me, but there was always work to do. One afternoon, Sarah handed me a mug of the station's terrible coffee. "Here's to hoping this is the scariest thing you face today," she said with a grin. I took a sip and winced. "It's a close call," I joked. "By the way," she added, "the guys have a new nickname for you. Do I want to know?" "Tower Inferno," I chuckled. "Could be worse. At least they didn't go with Smokey's nemesis," she laughed. "Give it time." And so the days went on. The forest kept its secrets, and I kept doing my job. After all, someone has to make sure the coffee doesn't get any stronger. Alright, so picture this. You've been a park ranger for, 14 years? Give or take. You think you've seen it all, right? Everything the wilderness can throw at you. Well, that's what I thought too. My name is Felix, and I was stationed in Washington's Olympic National Park. Then came August 1996. That's when everything changed. See, I took a few breaks over the years, thinking maybe I was done with the woods. Turns out, the woods weren't done with me. The Olympic is this massive stretch of land, with these giant pine trees that seem to touch the sky. And the fog? It rolls in so thick, you'd think you were in some cheap horror movie. I always liked it though. It's peaceful, usually. The kind of place where you can actually find some quiet. But it's also the kind of place where things can sneak up on you. You might not see them till they're right on top of you, and by then it's probably too late. That morning I was at the Hoh Rainforest section, this huge dense area where the trees block out most of the sun, and you can lose track of time real quick. It's the kind of place that just eats sound, making you feel like you're the only thing moving for miles. I was supposed to check on some campers who hadn't reported back. People go missing out here sometimes, but 99% of the time, they just got lost or didn't realize how tough the terrain can be. Still, this group hadn't checked in for days, and something felt off. There were 4 of them, experienced hikers, they said. 3 men and a woman. I figured they probably just lost their signal or maybe decided to stay out longer without telling us. Standard stuff. I definitely wasn't expecting to find what I did. About half a mile from their campsite, I found the first clue. A backpack, half buried in the mud. It looked like it had been ripped apart by something big. Too big for a bear, which ruled out the usual suspect. I looked around, hoping to find their trail, or at least something that would tell me what had happened. There was nothing but silence, and that creepy feeling you get when you know the woods are watching you. Maybe it's a ranger thing, but when the forest gets that quiet, it's never good. I pushed on, and then I found their tent, or what was left of it. The thing was shredded, like something had torn it apart just for the fun of it. Like it was angry. That's when I saw the blood. Not a lot at first, just enough to paint a really messed up picture in my head. I tried to radio in, but all I got was static. Typical. I figured I couldn't just turn back, so I kept going, following this faint trail of what looked like smeared blood deeper into the woods. I found 2 bodies maybe 15 minutes later. One of the guys, or what was left of him, was sprawled out near a fallen log. His torso was torn open like some kind of sick display, and his face, it was gone. Completely gone, like something had just ripped it off. The other one was the woman. She wasn't any better off, but at least she still had a face, if you could call it mercy. Now, I've seen some messed up things in these woods, but this wasn't natural. No animal I've ever come across does this, not even the mountain lions. And trust me, they're as vicious as it gets out here. I wanted to puke. Hell, I nearly did. But something kept me going, probably just the sheer disbelief of it all. Whatever did this wasn't hunting for food. It was killing for sport, or maybe something worse. I was about to turn back when I heard something. Branches breaking, heavy, deliberate steps in the underbrush. They weren't human steps. They were too heavy, too uneven. I should have left right then and there, but curiosity, you know? It has a way of turning a bad situation into a complete disaster. I took out my flashlight. the kind that doubles as a club if you need it, and slowly made my way toward the sound. I've regretted a lot of things in my life, but nothing like turning that corner. It was there, hunched over the remains of one of the hikers, picking at him like he was an afterthought. Its limbs were long and sinewy, covered in this mix of dark fur and something that looked like scales. Its mouth, if you could call it that, was wide, way too wide, lined with teeth that looked like they belonged on a shark. But it wasn't the teeth that got me, it was the way it used them. This thing wasn't just eating, it was playing, tearing off chunks and then tossing them aside like it was bored, like it needed something else to satisfy whatever sick craving it had. For a moment, I just froze. You'd think survival instinct would kick in, but my brain just checked out. There was no fight or flight, just staring. Maybe it was shock, or maybe I thought if I didn't move it wouldn't see me. Yeah, well, turns out that was stupid. It saw me, all right. One of its limbs shot up suddenly, and in an instant, it was on me. I didn't even have time to raise my flashlight before it swiped at my chest, knocking me back into the mud. Pain ripped through me, and I realized it had torn my shirt open. Thankfully, that was all. I scrambled to my feet, swinging the flashlight wildly. I must have hit something because it let out this low, vibrating noise, almost like it was annoyed more than hurt. I didn't wait to see if I could get another swing in. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, and I'm no sprinter. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, tearing at the plants like it wasn't used to anything putting up a fight. But somehow, I managed to stay ahead of it, just barely. I stumbled back into the campsite, gasping for air, and grabbed the only thing that made sense, one of the flare guns the group had packed. Not ideal, but better than nothing. I pointed it toward the noise and fired. The thing screeched, at least I think it did, and then everything went quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd scared it off. Maybe it had slunk back into whatever nightmare it had crawled out of. Then I saw the flare still burning, but there was nothing beneath it. No sign of the creature, just the bodies. I stood there staring at the carnage, knowing damn well this wasn't over. I don't remember much about how I got back to the ranger station. It's all a blur of running and tripping over branches. But when I burst through the door, drenched in sweat and blood, I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost. The other rangers started asking questions, but I couldn't answer them. I couldn't tell them what I'd seen because who the hell would believe it? Later that night, when the search party went out, they found the bodies, those poor hikers, mangled and dismembered, just like I'd found them. They called it an animal attack. Probably a bear, they said. Of course it wasn't a bear, but explaining that to anyone would have made me sound like I'd lost my mind. I couldn't risk it. I'd be laughed out of the job. There was only one problem. 2 of the bodies were never found. They were just gone. But I never mentioned that part. I don't go back to the Hoh Rainforest section anymore. Not unless I have to. And even then, I don't go alone. Whatever that thing was, I'm pretty sure it's still out there wandering those woods. Maybe it's moved on, but something tells me it hasn't. But hey, if it comes back, maybe next time it'll pick someone more deserving. Maybe a guy who enjoys nature walks a little too much. It was 1996, and I, Cole Hatcher, was stuck working the ass end of the Great Smoky Mountains. For 10 years I'd been hopping between ranger jobs all over the Appalachians. Not exactly the life I pictured when I was buried in English lit books back in college. But hey, dealing with bears and the occasional freaked-out tourist beat the hell out of dissecting some dead guy's poetry, right? People call me all sorts of things. Squiet, stubborn, maybe a little too straightforward for my own good. But most folks seem to like me well enough. Even the tourists I have to drag back to the trails after they've wandered off. I always tell them to buy a damn map next time. Usually gets a chuckle. My patrol that day was as average as a Monday morning could get. There's this one section of the park where hikers are always getting lost. It's notorious for it. Not because they get snatched by Bigfoot, mind you, but because most of them think their fancy GPS is a substitute for common sense. People underestimate the Smokies, figuring it's so well traveled that it can't possibly be dangerous. They're dead wrong. That morning I had the pleasure of escorting a family of 4 back to the main trailhead after they'd gotten themselves all turned around. Nice folks. From Texas, I think. After I got them back on track, I radioed in and kept moving. Nothing to see here, just trees, the occasional hawk and squirrels acting like they owned the place. Around noon, I hit up this area near a spot called Ramsey's View. It's known for its wide-open views and chill breezes. It was one of my favorite spots to grab a sandwich and pretend I had the best job in the world. But something felt off. You ever get that feeling when the forest just goes dead silent? Like nature's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen? That was the vibe. At first, I figured it was just a bear, maybe a big one lumbering around in the underbrush. That would explain why the birds all shut up at once. But when I listened closer, there wasn't even the crack of a twig. Nothing. So I did what any rational person would do. I took another bite of my sandwich and figured whatever it was would pass. Besides, bears don't care much for turkey and cheddar, so I wasn't exactly on the menu. But then I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees, big. Too big for a bear. It moved fast, almost like it was gliding just above the ground. My stomach dropped, but I didn't move right away. Rangers see a lot of weird crap in the woods. Most of it's explainable. But this didn't feel right. I stood up, scanning the tree line, and reached for my radio. Now, here's the thing about radios in the Smokies, they're garbage most of the time, and today was no exception. Just static, like the damn thing was mocking me for even trying. The movement stopped, and for a second, I thought maybe I was just tired, my brain playing tricks on me. I mean, it happens. You stare at enough trees, and suddenly you're seeing faces in the bark. But just as I started to turn back to the trail, I heard something. Footsteps, but not the heavy plod of a bear or the lighter tap of a deer. No, this was different. These steps were slow, deliberate, like something was stalking. I started backing up, my hand resting on the holster of my sidearm, though I hadn't drawn it yet. You don't go pointing guns at every shadow, not in my line of work. That's a quick way to lose your job and end up on the evening news. Then it came into view, sort of. The thing stepped out from behind a thick tree, but it didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. It was hunched over, with long limbs and a body covered in patches of what looked like fur. But it was too uneven, almost mangy. Its legs were bent in a way that reminded me of a wolf, but it moved on 2 feet, like a person. Only its gait was jerky, unnatural. I know wolves, bears, even the occasional mountain lion when they wander this far east. But this was none of those. I froze, every instinct in me screaming to do the opposite. But instead, I just stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as it shifted its head, sniffing the air. Its nose, if you could call it that, looked like it had been mashed up and spread too wide across its face, like someone had taken parts from different animals and just stuck them together in some messed up patchwork. I don't scare easy. It's part of the job. But this was different. This thing wasn't supposed to exist. And yet, here it was. Some patchwork nightmare, just casually walking through the Smokies like it owned the place. Before I could even reach for my gun, it bolted straight at me. Now, I've had wild animals charge before, but they usually stop once they realize you're human, not lunch. This thing, it didn't stop. And that's when it hit meat, wasn't hunting. It was killing. For sport. I barely had time to pull my weapon before it was on me, its massive arm sweeping toward my head. I ducked just in time, stumbling backward into the dirt. My back hit a tree, knocking the wind out of me. I raised my gun, finger on the trigger, but hesitated. One part of my brain was still trying to process what the hell I was looking at. It didn't give me time to think. Its next swipe caught the edge of my vest, sending me sprawling to the ground. That's when I noticed the blood, not mine, on its claws. I couldn't place the smell at first, but then it hit a metallic tang of human blood. Someone had already met this thing today, and they hadn't fared so well. I fired twice, the shots echoing through the trees, but the thing barely flinched. It was like shooting at a moving tank. The bullets just grazed its skin, leaving dark patches of fur singed but no real damage. That's when I realized I was in deep shit. Desperate, I rolled to the side, using the tree for cover as it lunged again. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short gasps. The radio was still crackling uselessly in my pocket, and my mind raced for a plan. I don't know what came over me, but instead of running, I stood my ground. Maybe it was stupidity, maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe I was just too pissed off to care. I aimed my gun again, this time going for the legs. It roared, or at least made a noise that sounded like roaring, and dropped to one knee, its jerky movements faltering for the first time. I took the chance and ran, sprinting down the slope toward the trailhead. The thing was behind me. I could hear it crashing through the brush, gaining ground. My lungs burned, but I kept going, my legs moving purely out of survival instinct. When I finally reached the main trail, I saw them, the family I'd helped earlier, oblivious to what was coming. They were packing up their gear near the parking lot, laughing, completely unaware. I shouted at them, waving my arms like a maniac, but they just stared at me like I'd lost it. That's when it hit them. The thing slammed into the father first, knocking him clean off his feet. He didn't even have time to scream. The mother turned, but by then, it was on her too. The kids, God, the kids, I couldn't get there fast enough. I don't know how I did it, but I managed to unload the rest of my clip into the thing's back. It staggered, wheeling around to face me, eyes burning with rage, but then it collapsed, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything was silent again. The kind of silence that makes you think maybe you imagined the whole thing. But there was no denying the carnage. The parents were gone, torn apart like rag dolls. The kids, a boy and a girl, both of them, were standing there, frozen in shock. I ran to them, scooping them up in my arms, trying to say something, anything that would make sense of what just happened. But what do you say? As I looked down at the body of the creature, I couldn't help but wonder what the hell it was. It didn't fit anything in the park's records, that's for sure. And as much as I wanted to chalk it up to some mutated bear or wolf, deep down, I knew this was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. The Park Service arrived not long after. The official report? They classified it as a rogue bear attack. But I knew better. We all did. Hell, even the cleanup crew wouldn't go near the thing without hazmat suits. But the government has a way of sweeping things under the rug, especially when it doesn't fit into their neat little boxes. A week later, I quit, packed my stuff and headed north. People ask me why I left, and I always give them the same answer. Sometimes you see things you can't explain, things that make you realize just how small you really are in the grand scheme of things. But here's the thing, it's not the creature that keeps me up at night, it's the laughter. The kids, in the middle of all that chaos, they laughed. Not because they were happy, but because they didn't understand what was happening. And for some reason, that's what haunts me the most. You want to know the worst part? When that creature fell, I swear I heard it mutter something, like a dying breath. But then again, maybe that was just my mind playing tricks on me one last time. Maybe. It was 2004 when I first set foot in the sprawling expanse of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. My name's Alex, but everyone calls me Lex Holloway, and I just landed a job as a park ranger, a dream I'd been chasing since I was a kid flipping through National Geographic magazines. The park's rolling hills and dense forests were a far cry from the concrete maze of Baltimore where I grew up, and I relished every moment of it. On my days off, I'd often hike the lesser-known trails, partly for solitude and partly because I fancied myself an amateur botanist. My colleagues joked that I could identify a tree faster than they could finish a cup of coffee. They weren't wrong. I'd always had a knack for noticing the small details. Call it a perk or a quirk, but it made me good at my job. One crisp autumn morning, I was assigned to check out a section of the park that had been closed off due to some unexplained animal disturbances. Livestock from neighboring farms had gone missing, and a few campers reported eerie sounds that didn't match any known wildlife. The higher-ups thought it might be a rogue bear or worse, poachers. I was teamed up with Ben McCready, a seasoned ranger with a dry wit and a penchant for sunflower seeds. "Ready for a walk in the woods, Lex?" Mac asked, cracking a seed between his teeth. "Always. Just hope the wildlife behaves itself today," I replied. "Well, if it doesn't, at least you can charm it with your tree facts," he quipped. We set out around 8 a.m., the sun just starting to filter through the canopy. The trail we followed was overgrown, seldom used by tourists. As we ventured deeper, the forest seemed to swallow us, the sounds of chirping birds giving way to an unsettling silence. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked. "Maybe the birds are giving us the silent treatment." Did you forget their birthdays? Mac joked. I chuckled, but the absence of sound gnawed at me. An hour in, we came across the first oddity, a deer carcass, or what was left of it. The body was mutilated beyond recognition, organs missing, bones exposed. That's not normal, Mac said, his tone shifting to seriousness. Could be a bear, but I've never seen one do this, I replied, crouching down to examine the remains. There were no drag marks, no signs of a struggle. Or maybe a mountain lion? Possibly, but they're rare around these parts. We documented the site, took some photos, and decided to press on. About half a mile later, the trees began to change. The oaks and maples gave way to twisted, gnarled trunks that looked ancient. The air grew thick, tinged with a metallic scent. Feels like we've stepped into a different world, Mac remarked. An older one, I said, touching the rough bark of a tree that seemed as old as time. Just then, a sound echoed, a low, haunting whistle that sent a chill down my spine. Did you hear that? I whispered. Probably the wind, Mac said, though his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. Since when does the wind sound like a funeral tune? We pressed on, each step heavier than the last. The trail disappeared entirely, and the underbrush grew dense. We hacked our way through, the silence only broken by that intermittent whistle. Suddenly we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin that wasn't on any of our maps. Looks like we found the local real estate hotspot, Mac said, attempting to lighten the mood. Yeah, a real fixer-upper, I replied. We approached cautiously. The cabin's windows were shattered, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, we found signs of recent activity. Discarded food cans, a smoldering fire pit. Someone's been squatting here, Mac observed. Or something, I said, pointing to the scratch marks on the walls. They were deep, parallel grooves that didn't match any tool or animal I knew. That's not exactly a welcoming decoration, he noted. A sudden thud came from the back room. We both drew our radios, standard issue, but hardly a defense. Probably just a raccoon, Mac whispered. With our luck, it's a real estate agent, I joked, trying to mask my unease. We edged toward the sound, pushing open the door. We found the room empty save for a large hole in the floorboards. Peering down, we realized it led to an underground tunnel. Well, that's not on the brochure, Mac said. I didn't know basements were trending in forest architecture. We decided to radio back for support. Base, this is Ranger Holloway. We've discovered an uncharted cabin and possible underground structure at coordinates. Static swallowed my words. That's odd, I said, tapping the radio. Let me try mine, Mac offered. Same result. Looks like we're on our own. Classic. We had a choice. Head back and report in person, or investigate further. The smart move was to leave, but curiosity got the better of us. 5 minutes, then we're out, I suggested. Fine, but if we get lost, I'm blaming you, Mac replied. We descended carefully into the hole, using our flashlights to illuminate the narrow passage. The walls were lined with strange symbols, etched deeply into the stone. Any idea what these mean? Mac asked. Not a clue. Maybe ancient graffiti artists? The tunnel opened up into a cavern. The air was thick, damp, and carried a foul odor. This is starting to feel like a bad idea, Mac muttered. Starting to? I thought that ship sailed when we skipped breakfast. At the far end of the cavern, we saw something that made us freeze. A pile of bones, both animal and unmistakably human. Well, that's concerning, I managed to say. Looks like we've found where the missing livestock and people ended up. Before we could react further, a shadow moved across the wall. Something was in here with us. Did you see that? Mac whispered. Yep, and I'm pretty sure it's not the welcoming committee. We backed toward the tunnel entrance when a figure emerged from the darkness. It stood on two legs like a human, but was covered in coarse fur. Its face resembled that of a hyena, jaws elongated with sharp teeth gleaming. That's not in any field guide I've read, I said. Time to go, Mac yelled. We turned to run, but the creature was fast, too fast. It let out a sound, a mix between a cackle and a roar, that echoed painfully in the confined space. Split up, I shouted. Are you insane? Just do it. I darted to the left, hoping to draw it away. Mac hesitated but then bolted to the right. The creature chased after me, its footsteps heavy and relentless. I scrambled over rocks and ducked under low ceilings, my flashlight flickering. Why do I always get the fun jobs? I mumbled. I spotted a narrow crevice ahead and squeezed through. The creature clawed at the entrance, unable to fit. Ha, guess you skipped yoga class, I taunted. I didn't have long. I needed to find a way out and regroup with Mac. Crawling through the tight space, I emerged into another tunnel. This one had a faint light at the end. Please be an exit, I whispered. As I approached, the smell hit me, fresh air mixed with the scent of pine. Relief washed over me until I heard Mac scream. Without thinking, I rushed back, navigating the labyrinth of tunnels. I followed the echoes of his voice. I found him in a chamber, cornered by not one but two of the creatures. Mac, I shouted. He looked at me, eyes wide. Lex, get out of here. Not without you. I searched frantically for anything to use as a weapon. Spotting a loose stalactite, I grabbed it and hurled it at one of the creatures. It struck its shoulder, causing it to snarl and turn toward me. Hey, overgrown Fido, fetch, I yelled. The creature charged. I dodged, causing it to crash into the wall. Mac took the opportunity to throw a rock at the other one, hitting it square in the face. Nice arm, I called out. Played a little baseball in college, he replied. We didn't waste any more time. Running together, we headed for what we hoped was the way out. The tunnels seemed to twist and turn, each passage looking the same. Any idea where we're going? Mac asked. Just following the left-hand rule, I said. What's that? Always take the left path, supposed to lead you out of mazes. Let's hope it works for caves, too. The creatures were behind us, their snarls echoing. One of them let out that eerie cackling sound again. Sounds like they're laughing at us, Mac noted. Maybe they heard your jokes. Harsh, even now. We reached a fork. Without hesitation, we took the left path. The ground began to slope upward, and a breeze touched our faces. We're close, I exclaimed. Bursting out of an opening, we found ourselves halfway up a rocky hillside. The forest stretched out below, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. Now what? Mac panted. Head downhill. Maybe we can lose them in the trees. We scrambled down the slope, loose rocks tumbling with each step. Behind us, the creatures emerged from the cave, unfazed by the terrain. "These guys just don't give up," Max said. "Must be fans of ours." Reaching the tree line, we weaved between the trunks, trying to put as much distance as possible. I could hear the creatures crashing through the underbrush. "Got any more of those baseball skills?" I asked. Fresh out of rocks, an idea struck me. The old ranger station isn't far from here. We might find supplies, or at least a place to barricade ourselves. "Lead the way." We altered our course, heading east. The forest was dense here, but familiar. Memories guided me. The station came into view, a small wooden structure that had been abandoned years ago. We burst inside, slamming the door behind us. I shoved a heavy cabinet against it while Mac checked the windows. "Windows have bars. Guess they were worried about bears," he said. "Or something worse." Searching the room, we found a flare gun, some old lanterns, and a rusted fire axe. "Not exactly an arsenal, but it'll have to do," I said. "Better than nothing." The creatures reached the cabin, scratching and pounding on the door. "Persistent, aren't they?" Mac remarked. "I've had exes less clingy." One of them began to ram the door repeatedly. The wood started to splinter. "Time for Plan B," I suggested. "Mac, distraction. I'll shoot a flare through the back window to draw them away. When they chase it, we make a run for the main station. Risky, but I like it." I loaded the flare gun and aimed it out the rear window, firing into the sky. The bright light arced and descended into the forest, hissing. The pounding stopped. "Did it work?" Mac whispered. A moment of silence, then a crash. The creatures were breaking through the front door. "Guess they didn't fall for it," I said. "Plan C, fight." One creature burst through, its eyes locked onto us. Mac swung the fire axe, grazing its arm. It snarled and lunged at him. I grabbed the lantern and threw it at the second one entering behind. The glass shattered, oil splattering and igniting upon contact with the creature's fur. "Looks like you're fired," I shouted. The flaming creature thrashed wildly, crashing into its companion. They both stumbled back outside, the fire spreading to dry leaves around the cabin. "Great. Now the forest is on fire," Mac noted. "At least it might slow them down." We seized the moment and dashed out the back door, smoke beginning to fill the air as the flames grew. "Think Smokey the Bear's going to be upset," I quipped. "Let's survive first. Worry about the lecture later." We raced toward the main station, our lungs burning from exertion and smoke. Behind us, the fire roared, but the creatures were no longer in sight. Bursting into the main station, we startled Ellie, the dispatcher. "What happened to you two?" she exclaimed. "No time to explain fully," I said between breaths. "There are things out there. We need to alert the authorities." Mac collapsed into a chair. "And maybe a cold drink wouldn't hurt." We relayed our story to the bewildered staff. Calls were made, and soon law enforcement and additional rangers were dispatched to the area. "Do you think they'll find them?" Ellie asked quietly. "I hope so. Whatever they are, they're dangerous," I replied. Days later, search teams recovered evidence from the cavern bones, personal effects of missing persons, and those strange symbols etched into the walls. However, no creatures were found. Official reports labeled it a case of wild animal attacks, possibly a previously unknown species. Mac and I knew that wasn't the case, but there was little more we could do. "Well, Lex, looks like we've added monster hunters to our resumes," Max said as we stood at the edge of the burned section of forest. Not exactly the career progression I had in mind. Could be worse. We could be the ones on milk cartons. True. Always got to look on the bright side. As we turned to head back, Mac chuckled. You know, if this whole ranger thing doesn't work out, we could always go into stand-up comedy. With your jokes, we'd be chased off the stage faster than we were chased by those creatures. Hey, at least the audience wouldn't be trying to eat us. Can't argue with that. Life at the park slowly returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after what we'd experienced. The area around the cavern remained off limits, a quiet reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the safety of the well-trodden paths. One afternoon, a delivery arrived for me at the station, a package with no return address. Inside was an old book filled with sketches resembling the symbols we'd seen and illustrations of creatures similar to what we encountered. Looks like we've got some light reading, Max said over my shoulder. Or a new mystery to solve. Think we're up for it. I closed the book thoughtfully. Well, we did survive round one. Besides, someone has to keep an eye on things around here. Good thing we didn't skip career day back in school. Yeah. Who knew Ranger came with so many surprises? As we filed the book away, ready to tackle whatever came next, I couldn't help but appreciate the irony. I'd left the city seeking peace and ended up finding mysteries deeper than any urban jungle could offer. Ready for another day in paradise? I asked. Always. After all, someone's got to make sure you don't get lost again. We get lost? I think your sense of direction is still back in that cavern. Touché. We headed out on our patrol, the vast wilderness stretching before us. The sun peeked through the trees, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. By the way, you still owe me that breakfast we skipped, Max said. Fine. But if the bacon tries to bite back, I'm out. Deal. And with that, we ventured back into the woods, ever vigilant, ever curious, and perhaps just a bit wiser about the secrets the forest chose to keep. It was 2001 when I was about 6 years deep into my gig as a park ranger at Isle Royale National Park, right off the Michigan coast in Lake Superior. Now, this ain't the kind of place you just stumble upon unless you're running from something or someone, like me. Yeah, I left behind more than a few skeletons when I took this job. Let's just say I burned enough bridges that the only place left was an island. My name's Alex Riley, and by then, I'd been living alone in a ranger cabin for nearly 3 years. The remoteness suited me just fine. People yap too much anyway, and most of them think they got your whole life figured out after one lousy conversation. I wasn't on the run from anything crazy, no mobsters or crazy ex-wife, just bad decisions, a failed business, and a mountain of unpaid bills, you know, the usual small-time screw-ups that stick to you like glue once they pile high enough. This place had wolves and moose for neighbors, and I didn't mind one bit. If a wolf comes after you, it's 'cause you're in its territory, not 'cause it heard some juicy gossip about how you used to be a loser. I like that about them, predictable, unlike people. So, on this particular day, we get a call over the radio. Well, not exactly a call, more like static, some panicked shouting, and then silence. It was one of the seasonal hikers, a guy who'd come in for a week-long camping trip with his wife and a buddy. They weren't supposed to leave their campsite for another 2 days, but something was clearly messed up. Of course, no one else was close enough to go check it out. The park's wilderness stretched across 200 plus square miles, with only a handful of us on duty. And, like some twisted cosmic joke, I was the closest one. I threw on my boots, grabbed my gear, and set out. Took me a few hours to hike out to their site. There was something off about the woods that day. Call it instinct or paranoia, but I could feel it. The birds weren't chirping, no rustling from the usual critters darting through the underbrush, just stillness. The kind that makes you feel like someone's staring a hole into the back of your neck. Their campsite wasn't much of a camp anymore when I arrived. The tent was shredded, like someone took a knife to it. The fire pit was overturned, food scattered everywhere. No sign of the people who were supposed to be there. I took out my radio and tried to reach them. Nothing. Tried the park office. Nothing. It was almost like whoever or whatever had been there didn't want me getting help. I thought back to the rumors the locals, mostly the few old-timers left on the mainland, liked to tell. Tales of something else on the island. Something that didn't fit into the neat categories of predator and prey. But then again, locals love their tall tales. I used to chalk it up to booze, boredom, or too many nights alone under the stars. Then I spotted blood near the tent. Not a lot, but enough to suggest someone got hurt. I started tracking it, a thin smear leading deeper into the trees. It wasn't until I heard the scream, a scream I'll never forget, that I knew whatever I was tracking wasn't just some ordinary animal attack. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was fear, pure, primal fear. And it was coming from up ahead. I don't know what I expected to find, but I sure as hell didn't expect the scene that greeted me. The man, his name was Ben according to the visitor logs, was half dragged across the ground. His leg caught in some kind of messed up trap. Not like a bear trap. This was crude, made of jagged wood and scraps of metal, something a person would have built, not a machine. Ben was barely conscious, his breath ragged, his eyes wide and wild. When he saw me, he muttered something. It got them, it took them, over and over, like a scratched record stuck on the same groove. His buddy and wife, Sarah and Mike, were nowhere to be found. And judging by the way the campsite had been torn apart, I wasn't sure I wanted to find them. But here's the kicker. What dragged Ben wasn't a human being. It wasn't even an animal I could place. There were prints leading away from the trap, long and deep in the dirt, clawed, but not like a wolf or a bear. Something about the spacing felt wrong, too. It walked on 2 legs, but wasn't man-shaped. Too heavy for that, too deliberate. At that moment, it was like everything I'd shrugged off. All the whispers, the stories from the old-timers, rushed into my mind. I don't believe in monsters, not the kind that live under your bed anyway. But whatever did this, it didn't belong in any ranger's manual. I couldn't just leave Ben, though. I tried to pull him free, but the trap was buried too deep. And with every tug, his screams got worse. Not exactly the sound you want echoing through an empty forest when you know something's still out there. I told him to shut it, to calm down. I told him I'd come back with help, but I never got that chance. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, lumbering between the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. A shape that didn't make sense. too tall, too thick, moving with a deliberate, almost mechanical gait. And then I realized it was watching me. When I turned fully to face it, it stopped, like it was sizing me up, trying to decide if I was a threat or the next course. Its face, or at least what I could make out in the dappled light, was a twisted combination of features that didn't belong together. Like someone had mixed the head of a giant bear with that of a gorilla, but stretched and wrong. Its snout protruded awkwardly, and tufts of patchy fur stuck out at odd angles. One hand, or paw, whatever you want to call it, clutched a large, pointed bone, almost like a spear. Before I could do anything, the thing let out a breath, a low, heavy exhale that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath me. It didn't charge, it didn't need to. Ben's eyes had gone wide, his frantic whispers turning to panicked breaths. I don't know what snapped in me. Maybe it was survival instinct, or maybe I'm just a coward, but I grabbed my rifle and fired one shot. I'm not even sure it hit. The creature didn't flinch, didn't stagger back. It just stood there. And that's when I realized the gun wasn't going to help. I backed away slowly, pulling Ben as far as I could, though he was barely moving now. The thing was still watching, still deciding. I don't think it cared about us, not really. It was like we were trespassing, like we were part of some game it played when the tourists came around. Then Ben started coughing up blood. It was bad, real bad. I muttered something about going to get help, told him to hang on. He mumbled something about Sarah and Mike again, but I could barely hear him. And just like that, Ben was gone. I don't know why, but the creature didn't come after me. I ran, didn't look back. I know, heroic, right? Ben's body was found the next day by another ranger, Jake. Sarah and Mike never turned up. I filed my report, wrote it off as an animal attack. But what kind of animal traps humans and drags them away like some messed up game? What kind of animal watches you with something like curiosity while it decides whether to rip you apart? The Ranger Service decided not to ask too many questions. Too many accidents like this had happened over the years. But let's just say they weren't eager to put the park in any brochures after that. Last I heard, they pulled Ben's body back to the mainland, left it for the state police. No one's claimed to have seen the thing since, but I haven't exactly been checking. So, that's it. The great lesson I learned. You can run from debt collectors and failed relationships, but there's no running from whatever's out there, especially when it's smarter than you. Alright, so it's not every day you find yourself in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, questioning your life choices. I mean, I never pictured a career as a park ranger could get this complicated. But here I am, smack dab in Chiricahua National Monument, knee-deep in the weirdest day of my life. Name's Jack Stratton, and this was back in 1991. I'd been in this line of work for about 5 years, and up until today the biggest headache I ever had was dealing with some rowdy campers who thought they were auditioning for Deliverance. The morning started off simple enough. I was out on a routine patrol, mostly just making sure some of the hikers weren't getting lost or breaking park rules. Honestly, it was an excuse to get some fresh air and peace of mind. The desert out here is something else. Cactus-studded ridges and rugged rock formations, the kind of landscape you can get lost in, literally and mentally. Not much grows out here except for yucca and bad ideas. Around noon, I got a call from dispatch about some campers in an unmarked area. They weren't supposed to be there. The region was off limits due to unstable ground. I figured it was just some teenagers thinking they were invincible. Happens more often than you'd think. I threw on my hat, grabbed my radio, and set off in the truck. Easy fix, or so I thought. Now, here's where things get strange. As I'm driving down this dusty path toward this unmarked zone, I get this feeling. You ever just have that sense that something isn't right? Not in a spooky way, but in a, wait, why am I doing this? Sort of way. My gut was screaming at me to turn around, but I'd already gone too far. Plus, I figured I could be back in time for lunch. When I reached the general area, I parked the truck and hiked the rest of the way. I was about half a mile in when I noticed the smell. Now, if you've ever been near a dead animal that's been roasting in the desert sun, you know that smell. It's pungent, thick, and gets into your nostrils like it's planning to stay there. Only this wasn't just an old animal carcass. It was something much worse. I pushed through the scrub, following that awful smell like some morbid bloodhound, and stumbled onto a small clearing. And there it was, a campsite. But not the kind you'd expect. The tents were torn to shreds, like someone had gone at them with a set of bare claws. The fire pit was cold, untouched for at least a day or more. But the thing that caught my attention was the blood. There was blood everywhere, splattered across the dirt, smeared on what remained of the tents. I called out, half expecting someone to pop out from behind a rock with a lame excuse about a cougar or something. But nothing answered. The place was eerily quiet. I took a couple of steps forward, and that's when I saw it. The body. Or at least what was left of it. The guy, well, what was left of him was in pieces. Limbs scattered, torso ripped open like someone had gotten creative with a chainsaw. It wasn't pretty. I may have skipped breakfast that morning, but seeing that I was grateful there was nothing in my stomach to lose. I reached for my radio, fingers trembling more than I'd like to admit. I managed to call in what I'd found, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Dispatch tried to keep me calm, told me backup was on the way, but something told me it wasn't going to matter. Whatever did this wasn't gone. I could feel it. It wasn't long before I heard something. At first I thought it was just the wind, but no, it was something else. Something moving through the brush, circling me. My brain was trying to piece together what kind of animal could have done this. A mountain lion? No, they don't tear people apart like that. A bear? Not out here. My pulse was speeding up, but I had to stay calm. Panicking in situations like this gets you dead. And then I saw it. It was about 50 yards away, crouched low, moving through the undergrowth like a ghost. My first instinct was to compare it to a big cat, but that didn't seem right. It was too wrong. The thing was bigger than any cat I'd ever seen. Its limbs were too long, its movements too deliberate, too intelligent. And then it stood up, like a man, but it wasn't a man. Its skin was stretched tight over its skeletal frame, like a badly taxidermied animal, with patches of what looked like fur or something else clinging to its shoulders. I don't know what possessed me to freeze, but for a solid minute, I couldn't move. It looked at me, cocking its head like it was sizing me up, deciding whether I was worth the effort. I guess I didn't make the cut, because it slinked back into the brush as quietly as it had come. I was shaken, but not stupid. I started to back away, my hand on the holster at my side. I didn't have much, just a Glock. But at that moment, it felt like a pea shooter compared to what I'd seen. I was debating whether to take a shot at it or just haul ass out of there when I heard the scream. It wasn't far off. It was human, and whoever they were still alive, at least for the moment. I bolted toward the sound. Whatever fear I had was pushed aside by the need to do something, anything, to stop this thing. I broke through the thicket and found another campsite, this one even more destroyed than the first. A woman was on the ground clutching her leg, which was oozing blood. She looked up at me, eyes wide with terror, and pointed behind me. I spun around just in time to see it coming at me. That thing, that creature, had doubled back. It was fast, too fast, and before I knew it, I was on the ground, wrestling with something that shouldn't exist. It was strong, absurdly strong for something that looked like it was barely hanging on to life. I managed to get a few good kicks in, but it wasn't budging. Its breath was rancid, hot, and I could feel it trying to rip me apart like it had done to that other poor guy. Desperation has a way of making you do things you normally wouldn't. I reached for my Glock, yanked it free, and fired point blank into its side. The thing screeched, more out of anger than pain, and recoiled. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the woman under one arm, and started dragging her out of there. The creature didn't follow. Maybe the gunshot scared it off, or maybe it just didn't see us as worth the trouble anymore. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. We made it to the truck, barely, and I threw her in the passenger seat. I peeled out of there, not caring about the dirt flying up behind me. We didn't talk much during the drive back. She was in shock, bleeding badly, but still alive. I radioed in the situation, gave them what little details I could. As we hit the main road, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, just a shadow moving along the ridge. I didn't look back. The woman survived, barely, lost her leg though. The official report chalked it up to some kind of unknown animal attack. But I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just an animal. And the worst part? We never found the first body. The campsite was there, the blood was there, but the guy was gone, not a trace. A couple of days later, I quit my job. Arizona's a nice place and all, but after that, I figured I'd take my chances elsewhere. Maybe I'll try something safer, like working at a library. But hey, at least I can say I finally met a creature that wasn't on any wildlife chart. That's something, right? You win some, you lose some, and sometimes you almost get eaten by something that shouldn't exist. It was 6 months into my gig at Conjurin National Park when things went from weird to seriously wrong. Being a forest ranger ain't exactly glamorous, but it keeps me away from the messes I've been trying to outrun. People don't like to admit it, but being alone is a rare thing these days, and for a guy like me, whose past involves a couple of bad calls, a busted marriage, and an urge to avoid people, it's as close to heaven as you can get. It was 2002, and Conger cypress swamps stretched out like a forgotten corner of the world, so isolated it felt like time just stopped here. Now, I wasn't an idiot. I knew this job came with risks. People get lost, Wildlife gets a little too friendly, and every once in a while, you run into something you can't quite explain. That day started like most others. I'd gotten a report about some hikers who hadn't checked back in after heading out the day before. Their route took them deep into the swamp, a place that doesn't see many folks unless they know exactly where they're going. This group clearly didn't. As I made my way along the trail, the air felt unusually thick, thicker than the usual swamp humidity. It was like the trees were pressing in, suffocating, like they were watching me. The thought made me scoff. I had enough demons in my past without adding crazy ideas about haunted trees. I followed their last known path, eyes scanning for any sign of them, a broken branch, a stray footprint, anything. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The quiet was unsettling, not the usual nature quiet, but a total absence of life. No birds, no frogs, just the sound of my boots squelching in the mud. As I moved further in, the smell hit me. It was sharp, metallic blood, no doubt about it. I've hunted enough to know that smell all too well. My first thought was an animal attack. Maybe a wild boar. Those things could mess someone up real bad. But as I got closer, that theory went out the window. I found them, what was left of them, anyway. Two bodies, or rather, two piles of parts that used to be people. There was no sign of a struggle, no drag marks, nothing to suggest they even tried to fight back. Whatever got them fast. I'll admit, I'm no crime scene expert, but I knew enough to recognize that this wasn't any animal attack I'd ever seen. Their limbs looked like they'd been chewed on, but not by any predator I could name. The bites were jagged, uneven, like something had tried to both eat and tear them apart at the same time. The only thing that crossed my mind was how much it reminded me of a crocodile's death roll, but this wasn't croc country. I crouched down to get a better look, and that's when I noticed a third set of footprints. Not the hikers. These were huge. Whatever made them wasn't walking on four legs like a bear or a panther. It was on two, and the prints looked like they belonged to a giant bird or lizard. I cursed under my breath and radioed it in. I didn't mention the footprints at first. Figured it was better to just get the search and rescue team out there before throwing any wild theories around. As I waited for them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The trees were so dense, it felt like eyes were on me from every angle. I was trained for stuff like this. I've dealt with dangerous wildlife before, even tracked a cougar through the Sierra Nevadas once. But this was different. I didn't hear it approach. One minute I was standing by the bodies, the next I was flat on my back, my ears ringing, and something hot burning across my arm. I scrambled to get up, but my body felt slow, heavy. That's when I saw it, a blur of something dark and massive darting between the trees. It was fast, too fast for something that size. I caught a glimpse of its back, hunched and covered in thick matted hair. But it wasn't just hair. It looked like patches of scales ran along its shoulders and down its spine. I could only see bits of it through the trees, but its size. I've seen bears, and this thing made a grizzly look like a cub. My hand went to my side, realizing too late that my gun wasn't there. I'd left it in the station that morning, figuring I wouldn't need it for just another missing hiker call. Figures, right? The one time you don't bring it. I heard a sound low, rattling, almost like breathing, but more erratic. Desperate. It was circling me, moving through the trees in a way that felt too calculated, too aware. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself to stand, to keep my eyes moving. If I was going to make it out of here, I had to get ahead of it. The thing came at me from the left, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped and ran, sprinting in the opposite direction, not toward the station but deeper into the forest. Stupid, probably, but I wasn't thinking straight. All I knew was that if I tried to head back, it would catch me in the open. I had to lose it in the trees, where it couldn't use its size against me. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the brush, tearing apart branches like they were twigs. My lungs were burning, legs pumping as hard as they could, but I wasn't going to be able to keep this up forever. I stumbled into a clearing, my mind racing for options, but there were none. I was out in the open, completely exposed. Just as I braced myself for the worst, I heard something else. A gunshot. The sound echoed through the clearing, and for a split second, the creature hesitated. I didn't stop to think. I threw myself into a nearby thicket, keeping low, trying to make myself invisible. I peeked through the leaves and caught sight of another person. It was a man, armed, a rifle slung over his shoulder, and judging by the way he moved, he wasn't part of any search and rescue team. I couldn't see his face, but his stance told me he wasn't afraid. He was hunting. The creature didn't seem to like that. It let out this horrifying screech, like metal scraping on metal, and charged at him. But the guy didn't flinch. He raised the rifle and fired again, aiming for its head. I'll never forget the sound of that impact, the way the creature stumbled. But it didn't go down. It kept charging. In the chaos, I realized something. I had to make a run for it. This was my only chance. While it was distracted, I bolted. I ran faster than I'd ever run before, adrenaline and sheer panic pushing me forward. I could hear the gunshots behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I don't know how far I ran, but when I finally collapsed near the ranger station, my body gave out. The pain in my arm was searing, blood dripping from where its claws had caught me earlier. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the station with a rescue team hovering over me. They asked questions, but I didn't have any real answers. I wasn't even sure what I'd seen, and I wasn't about to tell them about the guy with the rifle. They wouldn't have believed me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. Later, they found the hikers' bodies, or what was left of them. As for the creature, there was no sign. The footprints, the blood, the carnage, it was all there, but whatever had done it was long gone. My name is Ethan Hayes, by the way. I'm not stupid, and I know what I saw. It wasn't some animal native to these parts, and it sure as hell wasn't a bear. But trying to explain that to anyone would just make me sound like a lunatic. So, I kept quiet. About a week later, they officially ruled it an animal attack. Case closed. But I know better. And every time I set foot in those woods, I can't shake the feeling that something's still out there, watching, waiting for its next shot at whoever is unlucky enough to cross its path. That rifle guy, I never saw him again. Maybe he didn't make it, maybe he did. He introduced himself as John Ripley before our encounter, and he seemed like the kind of guy who could handle himself. All I know is, I'm not paid enough to hunt monsters, and the next time I get a missing hiker call, I'm bringing my damn gun. I never thought I'd have to explain why I punched a devil moose in the face, but here we are. It was 1996, and I was working as a park ranger in Wrangell St. Elias National Park, Alaska. The job was perfect for me. After 2 years in the Marines, I developed a need for space, wide open space. Cities felt too cramped, and after one particularly nasty bar fight, I figured it was time for a change of pace. So, I traded beer bottles for bear spray and took up a job out here, guiding tourists and making sure nobody wandered off and froze to death. Simple, right? My name's Jack Riley. Yeah, I've got one of those last names that's easy to make fun of. You wouldn't believe the jokes I've heard over the years. Riley, more like lightly, as in he lightly does any work. Hilarious. But if I've learned anything in this line of work, it's to have thick skin and not take life too seriously. You spend enough time out here, you realize nature doesn't care much for your problems. The morning started normal enough. Cold, of course. You don't work in Alaska if you're not comfortable with your face freezing off every few minutes. I had a group of hikers, tourists from down south, all bundled up in their high-end gear like they were prepping for Everest. My job was simple: get them from point A to point B without anyone getting lost, trampled, or eaten. Easy enough, right? We were trekking a few miles into the forest when I noticed something was off. You develop this sense when you've been out in the wilderness long enough. The trees, the birds, even the air, everything was too still, too quiet. I didn't mention it at first. No need to spook a bunch of city slickers who probably thought the biggest threat they'd face today was a sunburn through their overpriced thermals. But something was wrong, and I could feel it in my gut. We crossed a frozen creek when one of the guys in the group, a lanky dude named Sam, started acting jittery. He kept looking over his shoulder like he was expecting someone to jump out from behind the trees. I told him, "Sam, you gotta relax, man. The only thing that'll get you out here is hypothermia, and I'm not about to carry your frozen ass back to the truck." He didn't laugh. Instead, he pointed to the tree line about 100 feet away and muttered something that sounded like big, something big. Now, in Alaska, when someone says big, your mind instantly goes to one of two things: moose or grizzly. Either way, you're in for a bad day. But I didn't see anything at first. The group huddled closer, which would have been touching if it didn't make them look like a bunch of overgrown penguins waddling in fear. And then I saw it, moving through the trees. It wasn't a bear, though, and it sure as hell wasn't a moose. The shape was wrong, too low to the ground, too fast. It moved between the trees like it owned the place, and I got a bad feeling that we were the uninvited guests. I glanced over at Sam, who had gone paler than the snow around us. He whispered something about a thing from the old stories, but I didn't have time for cryptic warnings. Whatever it was getting closer, and I didn't want to stick around long enough to ask for an autograph. "All right, folks," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We're heading back slowly. No running, no screaming. We'll make it back to the truck." Then, that's when the thing broke cover. Now, I've seen some strange animals in my time, but nothing like this. It looked like a cross between a wolverine and a bad dream. Its back was hunched, its fur matted and slick like it had rolled around in something unpleasant. Its legs were too long for its body, and its face, Christ, its face was the worst part. Imagine a wolf, but with its jaw unhinged like a snake's. It snapped at the air like it was tasting us. The tourists, bless their hearts, didn't listen to a damn word I said. Half of them bolted for the trucks, which was the worst possible move. This thing didn't need much encouragement to start its hunt, and as soon as the first person ran, it was off like a bullet. I didn't have a gun on me, which still feels like one of the dumbest things I've ever done. I usually carried one, but that morning I'd left it in the cabin, thinking we wouldn't run into anything more dangerous than a curious fox. So, there I was, standing in front of a group of panicked city folk, with nothing but my fists and a can of bear spray. The creature lunged at Sam, who was too frozen in place to react. I charged, not thinking, just moving. I caught it mid-pounce, slamming into its side with everything I had. It hit the ground hard, and I got a real close look at those teeth. They weren't fangs like a wolf's, more like the jagged edges of broken glass. Sam scrambled back, shouting something about the devil's dog, but I didn't have time to process that. The thing was already getting back up, and I could see it was pissed. I aimed the bear spray at its face and let loose. The spray hit it full on, and for a second, I thought it worked. The creature stumbled, shook its head, but then it growled, or whatever you call the sound it made. If anything, it looked angrier. I knew we weren't going to outrun this thing, not with how fast it moved. So, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I charged it again, aiming a punch straight at its face. Don't ask me why I thought that would work. Maybe I figured if it worked on a Marine drill sergeant, it'd work on this thing too. My fist connected, and I felt something crunch under my knuckles. The creature recoiled, letting out this high-pitched screech. I didn't stick around to admire my handiwork. I grabbed Sam and yelled at the others to move. We ran, the cold air burning my lungs, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear it behind us, its claws scraping the ice. The trucks were only 100 yards away, but it felt like miles. One of the women, a short lady named Beth, tripped on a patch of ice. I saw her go down, and for a split second I thought about leaving her. But you don't leave people behind, not out here. I grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet just as the creature closed in. It was too close now, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. I turned, ready to fight it off one last time, but then something unexpected happened. A loud bang echoed through the trees, and the creature yelped, stumbling to the side. I didn't know where the shot came from until I saw Mark, the other ranger, standing by the truck with his rifle. He fired again, and this time the creature went down, thrashing in the snow. I don't remember much after that, just a lot of shouting, people scrambling into the trucks, and Mark standing there, staring at the thing's twitching body. He came over panting, his rifle still smoking. "What the hell is that?" he asked, eyes wide. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that it wasn't anything I'd seen before, and I'd seen plenty. As we drove back to the ranger station, I couldn't stop thinking about what Sam had said earlier, about the old stories. Stories the old-timers and the native Alaskans sometimes told, about creatures that weren't quite natural, things that lived in the shadows of the deepest woods. I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something to them after all. Back at the station, we radioed for help, and a team came out to recover the creature's body. They wouldn't tell us what it was, just that it wasn't from around here. Yeah, no kidding. We never got any official word on what happened that day. And the tourists, well, they got their money's worth, that's for sure. They even left a hefty tip, probably out of sheer gratitude for not ending up as that thing's lunch. As for me, I'm still out here, still guiding people through the wilderness, though I make damn sure to carry my gun these days. And every now and then, when I hear a noise in the distance, I think about that thing, that devil moose, as some folks started calling it after that day. It's a bit of a joke around here now, but it's a joke with teeth. I think about those old stories and wonder if there's another one of those things out there, waiting for some poor idiot to make the wrong move. But hey, at least I can say I once punched a devil moose in the face and lived to tell the tale. And in case you're wondering, yes, Sam still sends me Christmas cards. We've got a bond now, you could say. A very, very weird bond.